This story took place in the summer of 2013. I was a 16-year-old female at the time. My mum and I were on a 6-week road trip across the country. During the 4th week of our trip, we found ourselves in New York. At this point in the trip, we were both exhausted from being on the road for so long and from spending far too much time alone together. But we had made it all the way across the country, so we weren't giving up on the adventure. One night, we had tickets to the Yankees game. We went, we enjoyed the game, and had a good night. The game was over at around 10 to 10:30, and we were staying in New Jersey. So in order to get back to the hotel, we had to take the subway, then walk some distance to Penn Station to take the train back to New Jersey. So we leave the stadium and get to the subway station, along with thousands of other baseball fans, and luckily, we're able to find the right subway and the exit we need to get off without a hitch. We got off the subway and left the subway station and started our walk to the train station. At this point, it was probably close to 11, and there weren't many people walking the streets. Being there from the LA area, I'm not new to the big city, but New York City was a new, foreign, exciting place to me. I was walking pretty slow, trying to take in all the sights. I was looking around and I realized we are right across the street from the Empire State Building. I was stoked and pointed it out to my mum. She, however, did not share in my enthusiasm, and with a look of sheer terror on her face, she says through gritted teeth, "Walk faster. Hurry up. Now." I was completely oblivious as to what was going on, but because of how scared she looked, I hurried up without question. She then leaned into me and said, "A guy behind you is about to grab your bag. If he does, let him have it and run." I was stupidly wearing a drawstring Angels backpack, which had been a free giveaway at a baseball game. I know that was a dead giveaway. I was a tourist. As my mum said that, I quickly glanced behind me. This huge man was only feet away and was intently looking over at me. He looked about 7 feet tall, and I am a mere 5'8". He towered over me. I started walking so fast I was almost at jogging pace. My mum then turned around and looked him squared in the eye, and she began walking as fast as me. We were approaching a large intersection, so we started looking around to see if we could yell for help if the guy started to grab me. Much to my relief, there was a cop car parked near the corner. The guy must have seen this too, and he turned the other way at the intersection. When we finally got to the train station, my mum had told me that she had noticed this man following us all the way from the subway station. I got extremely lucky that night, with the cop being there, and it served as a good lesson to me. I always pay more attention to my surroundings now. So creepy mugger dude from New York City, let's not meet again. This story was told to me by my grandfather, and told to him by his friend while he served in the Vietnam War. This is going to be told in the point of view of my grandfather's friend. Before I was drafted, I was working on a farm in Alabama. All my life I've been working on a farm with family and friends. We never had much money, so about 20 of us had to live in an old plantation house. On the property, there was an old barn where we kept the work horses, 1 mule and a few hogs. Next to the woods were some old slave houses that some of our friends lived in. Every morning as the sun rose, we rose. For breakfast, we ate whatever was for dinner the night before. We didn't have time to sit and wait for food to be cooked. Us kids had to work with the women, so we mostly just picked whatever was being harvested that year. Basically, I'm telling you it was hard work. We always had strange things happen to us. We were pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and the only time we'd seen new faces was when we went to town in our wagon to sell our vegetables. We couldn't just call 911 because we didn't have a single telephone. We didn't even have lights. We used candles and lanterns. The little bit of money we had wouldn't pay for electricity. One winter night, we were all settled down after a day of harvesting hay. The men were sitting around the fireplace smoking pipes, chewing tobacco and talking. The women were either talking to each other or reading some of the magazines we had brought from town. Me and the other children were laying in our beds whispering to each other, playing little games while trying not to be heard by the adults downstairs. At about this time of night, one of the men had walked outside to the outhouse, which was behind the main house next to the forest. As he was reaching it, he heard an owl hooting from the trees. He didn't think that was weird. Owls were common, but the thing that made him stop walking was how the owl's hoot changed to a coyote howl. After that, it became a donkey braying, and after that it was a high-pitched whistle. The man yelled into the woods, thinking and hoping it was just someone playing a trick. He walked back into the main house and peed beside the porch, even though the women told him not to do it in the past. He didn't care about what they had to say. He didn't feel right about using the outhouse at that moment. About half an hour later, the dog starts barking. The men shrug it off, thinking it's a deer or something, but the barking got worse. It almost sounded like the dog was barking at an intruder. And then, just as suddenly, the dog stopped barking. The men knew something was up. So did the women. So a few of them went outside to check on the dog. When they found the dog behind the barn, its belly was ripped open, and its tongue appeared to have been bitten off. They knew a coyote didn't do this, nor a bobcat. One of the men picked up the corpse of the dog, and they all walked back to the main house to get a rifle and bury it. As they were burying the dog, the horses inside the barn started raising hell. The men knew whatever it was that killed the dog was now after the horses, so they ran into the barn and ripped open the door. They calmed the horses and searched the barn for the animal, and as they were searching, one of the men pointed that all of the horses' tails were braided. At about the time he pointed this out, they heard footsteps in the hayloft. Two of the men rushed to climb the ladder, but when they got to the top, they found no one. Everyone knew what had visited the farm that night. It is known for witches to braid the tails of horses. It is known for them to make weird sounds to draw in their prey. It's a story that I'll never forget. It's something that will always make my skin crawl. This happened 2 years ago, when I had just finished high school. I was 18 at the time, and I was not the most popular girl in my school. However, I did not go completely unnoticed. I'm mentioning this to you because I'm attractive as a female, and I do work out occasionally. I'm half Hispanic, half Caucasian, have light fair skin and dark black hair. I'm only telling you this so that you have an idea of what I look like. The thing is, I didn't have any friends. I have trust issues, which is a story for another time. I wasn't that close to my family either, so most of my social life and interactions were online. In my social life, I communicated with mostly cute guys in my city. Preferably, I only talked to younger guys, and if they were not in my city, I didn't reply because I didn't have a car. This also means that when I would go out on dates, these guys would have to pick me up. Most of my dates were nothing serious. It was mostly fun and games, but I did eventually want a relationship. Eventually, I came upon this Facebook message from this guy with a simple greeting. "Hi, how are you?" He seemed completely normal. He was not the most attractive guy that I would normally go out with, but something about him caught my attention, and I couldn't really describe it. You know that feeling when they might feel like they're the one, even if you've never met them? I do believe that I was destined at one point to cross paths with my potential soulmate, so I decided to give this guy a shot. His name was Tyler, and looking at his Facebook profile, he was pretty slender but fit. He had fair white freckled skin, and his hair was ginger, which I also really liked about him. I had a thing for gingers. After reviewing his profile, which I'm sure everyone does before replying to someone they don't know, I decided to respond to Tyler and get to know him a little more. We eventually got into a conversation and we shared some similarities. After a week of conversation, we both decided it was time to meet in person. I was not conflicted about meeting Tyler in person because I had nothing else going on. I was not working yet, and I had just finished high school, so I had a lot of free time on my hands. The day we decided to meet came around, and Tyler already knew about my situation of not having a car, so he had planned on picking me up, and I decided to wear a cute, short black dress with a sweater over it, because it was slightly chilly outside, and I kept my long black hair straight and wore a little makeup. Sooner than later, the time Tyler was supposed to pick me up was here. It was around 9 p.m, which was the time we agreed he'd come to get me. But Tyler wasn't outside my house yet. He told me that he would be driving a black minivan, but I didn't see any black cars outside my house. It was getting late. An hour had passed, and Tyler didn't respond to any of my messages, though I could see they were all read. I was about to call it off when I got a notification from my phone. Tyler said he was finally here. I was annoyed of how long he took to arrive. However, my excitement was stronger, so I decided to put my shoes on and head out. Tyler was outside the car and greeted me. I looked at him, and I noticed he was underdressed than I was. He wore an orange hoodie and sweatpants, and I felt a bit embarrassed and thought I should have wore something more comfortable. I walked over to hug him, and he opened the door for me. Before I went inside though, I noticed that there were two people inside the car. There was a guy in the driver's seat and a female in the passenger seat. Alarms were going off in my head right away, but before I could do anything, Tyler escorted me in the car. Tyler then joins me in the back seat, and I was frightened to say the least, but I didn't know what this was yet, and Tyler never mentioned there would be people joining us. From the moment I got in, I wanted to leave. I noticed Tyler's appearance to be a bit older than he'd looked on Facebook. He was still attractive but looked tired, like he hadn't slept in a while. He never spoke one word to me inside the car either, which made me feel uneasy. All he did was wink at me several times on the ride, wherever we were going. We eventually pulled up to a motel, and I had an idea where this was going but wasn't sure yet. Everyone got out the car, and I was the last to leave. The others started to make their way to the motel, and Tyler grabbed my hand and made our way behind them. When we got inside the motel room, I noticed right away a girl passed out on the bed. I knew she was just sleeping though. Everyone got settled into the room, and I did my best to play along because I did not want to give off a vibe that alarmed everyone that would be trouble. As soon as a conversation was going, I found out that the girl from the passenger seat was Tyler's sister. She had glasses and was slightly overweight, and she looked a bit like Tyler. She also hadn't slept in days. Her name was Shelby, and I think the guy driving was the boyfriend of the girl asleep on the bed, as he was trying to tell us to be quiet. Tyler was still looking at me with these predatory eyes, like he hadn't been with a woman in a while, and Shelby was talking with the other guy who I didn't know the name of yet. It was not soon after that I realized I was in trouble. I saw drugs being taken out of a bag that they had on them, with more drugs hidden around the motel room. I knew it would be more difficult to get out of this situation now, but I had to keep a brave face on because if I showed any signs of weakness, I'd be done for. Throughout this entire time being here, which felt like hours, Tyler eventually looked away from me to take out this glass pipe and a lighter. I could only describe this substance he was smoking to be meth. I'd never done drugs before, so I was frightened by the sight but kept a cool face. I was quiet the entire time, and then the other guy caught on because he asked Tyler why I was so quiet. Tyler shrugged, and then asked me the dreaded question, "Would you like to smoke this, babe?" I didn't know how to respond to that. I was shocked and scared. My mind began racing with so many thoughts. It took me a few short seconds to say, "Yeah, sure. Thanks, babe." I decided to play this out as smartly as I could. I thought if I played along, I could sneak out somehow while everyone was caught off guard. Besides, in a situation like this, you have to think on your feet and be smart. If I'd have said no, I can imagine different scenarios of me not making it through the night. So playing this out, I waited for Tyler to finish smoking the pipe until it was my turn. After watching him for a few seconds, it was my turn. Tyler passed me the pipe. I hesitantly lit it and began to inhale the smoke. I wasn't sure if I did it right, but didn't care. I must not have smoked enough though, because Tyler continually persisted me to take longer breaths. He walked over towards me and held the pipe for me so I could try it again. I coughed the first several times, and the others looked at me. They must have noticed that it was my first time doing this, but I hoped that they would think it had been a while for me. Tyler took the pipe after I was done so that he could continue, and it wasn't soon after that I began to feel lightheaded. I was starting to feel symptoms I'd never experienced before. My heart began racing faster, and my vision began to widen, as I could now notice little details in the room that I couldn't before. I had butterflies in my stomach, but not the bad kind. I meant the really good kind, when you're experiencing your first kiss and the fireworks. I felt amazing, and that scared me. I wanted to leave then, but I had to keep my composure. It was really hard now, because they enhanced my fear and paranoia. Sitting the entire time there didn't make the situation any easier. Tyler then said to me, "Hey babe, you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. I just have to use the bathroom." I didn't really have to use it. I just had to move around. I didn't know if it had been what I had taken, or myself, or both. Tyler walked me over and led me to the bathroom at the end of the room, which was next to the door outside the motel. I thanked him and walked in, and attempted to lock the bathroom by first instinct, but there was no lock. I panicked a little and tried to think a way out of this little motel room. Suddenly, an idea. I could fake a phone call from someone I knew off my Facebook Messenger and see who was online. Maybe they could pick me up and get me out of here. It was the best idea in my head, so I went along with it and proceeded to pester anyone I knew who I thought could take me home. I asked several guys who seemed nice enough with the same message, explaining a short version of the situation. Most of them responded with, "Call 911. Some didn't answer. Luckily though, a very sweet guy responded to me, asking for my location. I didn't hesitate, and sent him my location straight away. His name was Kyle, and he looked around the same age as me, so I felt safe. After sending him my location, he sent me a message saying that he'd be there in 5 minutes. I was very happy that he wasn't that far, and I replied to his message saying thank you. I wasn't sure if I knew Kyle personally, but he did seem familiar. All I know is I had to find someone in my city on my Facebook friends list who was online and could somehow take me away from these junkies. And I did, so that was taken care of. Now all I had to do was find a way to explain to Tyler why I had to leave. I flushed the bathroom toilet, and even though I didn't use it, I washed my hands. I exited and noticed Shelby and the guy leaving the room. I saw Tyler continue to smoke the glass pipe, walked over to him, and took the time to think of a reason to tell him why I had to leave as he continued smoking. Thinking fast on my feet, I thought of stupid explanations to escape. After he finished his pipe, he looked at me and said, "Feeling all better, baby? You took a while, so I got worried. My sister and Vince went to grab snacks for us, so they left really quick to the gas station." I replied back saying, "Sorry about that, just been having lady problems. And is that the guy's name, Vince?" "Yeah, that's Vince. He's stolen from us before, so we're hanging out with him, pretending to like him." I hesitantly replied, asking, "Oh, what did he steal from you?" "He stole my sister's car and never returned it, so we're keeping him real close. You know what I'm saying? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer." I chuckled to Tyler softly, pretending to agree with him. I then had a bright idea to make an excuse to leave. "Hey Tyler, I have to check on my big brother. He said he'd be picking me up tonight and I have to see when he's coming to get me." He looked annoyed when I told him this, but I didn't care. I went on my phone and tried to call Kyle, who I messaged earlier, and he picked up after the first ring and told me he was there. I told him I'd be 2 minutes. I walked back over to Tyler, made an excuse how he's earlier than expected, and why I had to go. He stood up, glass pipe in hand, and told me that I wasn't leaving. I felt sick. As he said that, I wanted to throw up. I kept my composure, however, because I didn't think he would hurt me with someone else in the room, even if that person was a petite and passed out. I firmly told him, "Okay, let me run downstairs to the parking lot and tell him that I'm fine staying with you tonight." I grabbed his hand as I said this in the hopes that he would believe the lie. He looked conflicted about what I was saying, but agreed to let me walk outside to my fake brother Kyle from Facebook, who was saving me. Tyler watched me walk outside the motel room, and I could feel his eyes piercing behind my back. Even though I couldn't see him, I definitely felt it. I glanced behind me when I was going down the stairs to the parking lot to see if I was being followed. Fortunately, he wasn't. So I took that opportunity and dashed to find Carl's car. I didn't care if he heard me running to the parking lot in front of the motel as fast as I could. But then I panicked. I never asked Kyle which kind of car he drove, so I looked at every car until I saw anyone with their lights on. I then saw a car drive up to me, stop and roll down their window. It was Kyle. He opened the passenger seat and I immediately got inside. He looked worried, but I told him to just drive out of there, and he agreed. He seemed spooked by my reaction, and I didn't seem to like the area I was in either. So he drove out of there in a flash. But with my adrenaline acting like crazy, and paranoia from what I'd been taking, I kept glancing behind me, making sure we weren't being followed. But Kyle assured me we were safe. Eventually I felt safe enough, and told Kyle everything. He looked shocked by my responses, and he told me he was glad he could help me out. I told him again how grateful I was that he was there to pick me up, and he explained to me that he was glad to help a lady out if someone needed it. It was then that I found out Kyle wasn't just a stranger, but he was a date that I'd went out on a while ago from the Plenty of Fish dating app. Kyle was also a soldier who lived on a base in my area, and that made me feel safe. Once he arrived at my home, he told me to be careful with who I met up with. I hugged him, thanked him, and blocked Tyler on Facebook. I wasn't worried about Tyler knowing where I lived, because at the time a sheriff lived across from me, and Tyler knew about it too, because when he came to pick me up earlier that night, he looked around the neighborhood to see a sheriff's car across from my house. But the sheriff's car's lights weren't on, of course, which is why Tyler probably didn't get spooked right off the bat. But he did ask me earlier that night if I was the sheriff's daughter later on in the motel room. Only now do I wish I'd had said yes. I was always cautious from time to time living in my neighborhood, because he did know my address, and it wasn't until I moved that I felt safe again. To this day, I'm always careful of who I meet up with and where I'm going. And to Tyler and his junkie pals, get help, and let's not meet again. About 9 years ago, my dad's side of the family was talking about how they would hear and see witches in their younger days. My grandfather started to explain on how his father would see ladies at night walking towards this small lake in the outskirts of town, and they all carried a cat each, which he pointed out that cats didn't seem to have eyes, so it was rare to see these ladies. He said this was mostly at 2 to 3 a.m, because at 5 a.m, he would go to wash his clothes as the small lake was connected to the other water source, and the ladies would always seem to leave about 5 a.m. when he and the other people would show up. Even my grandma had encountered them, and I'm not sure because she sadly passed away before my dad turned 5, but I know that my grandfather said she would always be scared of them because they had long nails and wore hoods. Not only this, small kids would always end up with bite marks. Full moon days were the worst, as it seemed like there was smoke at the lake, and somehow it made people afraid to go early. He did say something about trying to go into and do some witch hunts, but oddly enough, the guy that he was going to do it with never appeared. This guy's disappearance connected to him talking later on some treasure that the ladies had given him to leave them alone. 2 others had gone with him, but only one showed up, and he had gone mad. It couldn't speak anymore, just scream. He'd been traumatized by something, and he died in hospital days later. Many years later, the infrastructure in the area became more prevalent, and the sightings of those ladies vanished. There are mountains that are said to be the home of their new location, although it's more common than the city folk believe in them less, as the rural areas are where they seem to congregate. When I was 8, my entire family moved from San Diego County to the middle of nowhere in Colorado. After less than 2 years of being there and having to put up with the ridiculous weather, my oldest brother decided he's finally had enough. He got his GED and left his ferrets behind for us to take care of them, since they're illegal in California, and headed west to move in with a friend. Or at least he tried to. He didn't even make it 5 hours before his car completely died because it couldn't handle driving through the Rockies. He was stranded in a tiny podunk town after dark, and his car got towed to a garage while the tow truck driver offered to drive him to a cheap but nice motel to spend the night, since we couldn't get to him until the next day. They passed by a Motel 6 or some other chain motel like that, but the driver said, "Ugh, I wouldn't leave my dog in a place like that. There's a way nicer motel just down the road for the same price," and kept driving until they showed up at this really run-down looking place. My brother thought it looked pretty bad, but he's kind of a shy and non-confrontational person. He's also scrawny and completely unintimidating, so we didn't say anything and just thanked the guy. He couldn't see it at night, but when my mum and I got there the next day, we realized just how weird the place was. They had a big pool right smack in the middle of the parking lot, but it was drained dry and looked like it had never been used. The entire family that owned the place, mom, dad, daughter and son, sat on plastic lawn chairs in between the pool and the building, facing the motel rooms all day long. Then we saw the inside of his room. The bathroom had a small window, which isn't unusual, but it was only 2 feet off the ground and next to the toilet, with nothing covering it or obstructing the view of anyone using the toilet, meaning anyone outside, like the owners, could watch you doing your business. There wasn't even a spot for a toilet paper holder, so the roll just had to sit on a shelf, and the whole room looked pretty run down. My brother then quietly told us he barely got any sleep the night before, because he was so terrified. At first, we assumed it was just because he was sleeping in a strange place alone, when he was only 17. But he pointed out a door near his bed. His room was the kind where it's connected to the room next to it by a hallway only a few feet long, with a door in each room. So large families staying in adjacent rooms can keep it open and get between the two without having to deal with keys. He said he heard a faint noise coming from the next room to his the night before. So we opened the door to see what was going on, and there was enough of a gap underneath to see that someone was standing right on the other side of the far door. My brother watched for a few minutes, and the guy's shadow never shifted, so he got creeped out and closed his own door, making sure to lock it, and went to bed. He woke up at some point to a strange sound and sat there trying to identify it for a minute before he suddenly realized it was a doorknob rattling. The guy had finally opened his own door and was trying to get into my brother's room. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but he was too scared to fall back asleep in case the guy tried again and picked the lock. And he was just telling us this story quietly, in case the guy could hear him through the walls. He never saw what he looked like, but who knows if the guy watched him while he checked into the room or something. I have no idea what he was planning on doing to my brother, but I'm sure it wasn't good. Add this to the strange, frustrating conversation my mum had with the owner of the hotel over the phone on the drive up, and the weird-ass mechanic shop the car was towed to, and the town became one of the creepiest places we'd ever had the misfortune of stopping in. It would have cost more to fix the car than it was actually worth, so we just abandoned it, and my brother had to come home again, which he was actually happy to do after such a freaky experience. My high school held an annual Euro tour, and I went on my first one in 2011, when I was 16. There would be a bunch of teachers and parents that came along to supervise, including our headmaster, and almost everything was scheduled. But we did get a few hours every day to explore the cities ourselves. The tour was 12 days long. This would be my first experience on a plane, so my first experience overseas as well. My friend and I were casually walking the streets of Rome, not too far from our hotel, taking pictures and whatnot, wasting time before we had to meet our entire group of 15 kids and 4 teachers for pizza at a small restaurant, and also very close to our hotel. This comes into play with what happened later at the restaurant. Fast forward, we're at this restaurant now, all sitting on the sidewalk eating pizza and chatting. The teachers were sitting inside the restaurant right near the door to keep an eye on what was happening outside. I decided to go next door to buy myself a bottle of water. I didn't think to take anyone with me. as this was a tiny corner store close to the pizza place that just a few kids were sitting near the entrance of. After leaving the store, I got pushed against a large post by a man in a dark jacket. He towered over me, opened his jacket to cover me, and asked my name. I was in such shock, I couldn't even respond. He asked me again, and I refused to tell him. Luckily, one of the girls saw this happening, ran over and grabbed me out of the man's reach, and I immediately burst out crying and we alerted the teachers. Our headmaster, thinking he may just have been a drunk, shouted at him to leave, and the man disappeared around the corner. All was well. Things calmed down. I was now standing against the wall with 6 people in front of me, closer to the entrance. The same man then pops out again of what seems like nowhere and tries to break through the people in front to grab me again. This causes huge havoc with everyone around us, and now all adults are on high alert and getting involved, trying to chase this man away, only to see him run a little further down the road and hop into a white car and drive off. We got the entire group together again and were escorted back to the hotel, very confused by the situation. Later that evening, we got our free time, where we got to pick our own restaurant in the area and go with our group of friends. We were normally in groups of 5. We dressed up, walked down the streets until we found a restaurant we liked. The earlier incident had lost its worry with all the excitement and activities that were going on, and we were heavily distracted. We then all, the whole tour group, minus adults, decided to meet up at a bar, since Eurotours can't be complete without the older group trying to act a little naughty, slipping in a few irresponsible drinks before curfew. As I got to the entrance, I was pulled inside by 2 of the people on my tour and told to sit down. Apparently, someone spotted the same man from earlier in the day, in the same white car, sitting parked a little further down the dark road. This time, he was with another man. I broke down. We were all terrified. We explained what was going on to the owners, as best we could, and decided we had to head back out of the hotel as a group, constantly checking around us and keeping count of every person. Luckily, we were leaving for a different town not many hours away, very early next morning. This experience still haunts me. I don't know where the first man saw me or what his intentions were. He may have been following me the whole day, through the night, knowing exactly which hotel I was staying in and everything. Being from South Africa, Europe was another world to me, and we had this idea that everything was safe and free compared to our country. Looking back now, I wish I had not let my guard down. My local internet cafe is not much of a sight to behold. I think that's what may have contributed to it shutting down for a few months back in June. The exterior was reminiscent of an abandoned shack, with its dilapidated appearance and broken windows. However, after they cleaned up the inside, I definitely saw some improvements. Sparkly clean tile floors and beautiful mahogany countertops filled the cafe with a sense of ease and elegance. I always got plenty of work done in there, so the shop's grungy look never bothered me much, but it was very nice to have a change of scenery once the cleanup was done. I was probably the only regular at the cafe, venturing in on an almost daily basis. Plenty of other folks cycled in and out, but nary a familiar face would show up. This was fine, since I only went there to edit my vlogs and website on occasion. Striking up a conversation with someone recognizable was not on the agenda, ever. I was there for some much-needed peace and quiet, not small talk. Though I did have Wi-Fi at home, the thin walls there did little to muffle my father's drunken ramblings. The cafe was my escape from the unwanted noise. I strolled in on a Saturday morning, just 5 days after the grand reopening. I was feeling pretty groggy, still recovering from a cold I caught during the week. The humid August air didn't help matters. Because of this, I decided to grab a coffee before getting my things set up. I walked across the glimmering, newly replaced floors and heard them squeak under my sneakers. I laughed a little to myself, almost tempted to start turning in place just to hear the sound a few more times. No, I told myself. Grow up. I ordered my coffee and took a look around the room while I waited for it. I took a mental note of how many faces were in the cafe with me. I was surely going to grab a quiet little table in the corner, away from these strangers. Small iced regular? The barista held out my coffee and straw. Thanks, I said plainly. I threw down a couple of quarters as a tip and strolled over to the table I wanted. I spent the next few hours clipping and slicing my videos from the previous days. I was doing a week-long series about the gym I go to, basically workout tips, and some comedy bits with my buddy Jake, who works at the front desk. I found myself laughing out loud over a protein shake skit we had done. I may have drawn some attention to my little corner of the room. Though the staring eventually subsided, I felt it best for me to leave, as I had been there much longer than usual. I reached down and unplugged my laptop charger, and that's when my hand brushed up against something. Confused, I took a look under my table to investigate. A 16-inch black bag sat just beyond where my feet were settled. It had pockets and a shoulder strap, as well as an abundance of dust coating the leather. Holy crap, someone must have left their laptop behind. At first, I was going to do the right thing. I very easily could have handed it over to the barista and called it a day. I guess maybe that would have been the smart thing to do. However, a mixture of curiosity and stupidity overcame me, keeping me from being honest. Instead, after picking up my own things, I swung the mystery bag over my shoulder and swiftly exited the cafe. Stupid. I pulled into my family driveway at about noon, the hot summer sun beaming down onto my front lawn. My father was doing his usual half-assed inspections of the plants in the garden, beer can in hand. I tried to get into the house without a word to him, but he stopped me just as I opened the storm door. "Hey, why are you in such a hurry?" He asked this while taking a swig of his drink. "Dad, I don't have time. Important website business." Well, don't stop on my account." "But you just stopped me," I thought to myself. I pushed through the front door, passing my sleeping mother on the couch, and darted upstairs to my room. I slammed my door shut hard behind me and locked it immediately. I tossed my belongings and newly found goods onto the bed and kicked my shoes clear across the room. I was excited to dig into this lucky haul. Carefully and slowly, I unzipped the top of the bag and pulled it open. I gasped a little to myself. Despite the appearance of the bag, the contents were, no joke, a shiny brand new looking laptop nestled inside. I pulled it out and observed it with awe. It was certainly nicer than my basic 500 gig HP from a big box store. I couldn't believe what I was holding. I flipped it open and began feeling the keys and monitor. It was in mint condition. I had to be the luckiest guy in the world. Everything was there. Charger, wireless mouse. I even found a bag of screen wipes at the bottom. I dug into the pockets, curious as to what treasure I might find in there. What I found was a cell phone. Nothing special. Android phone. It was still powered on and had no lock screen. Exploring further, I noticed there were no texts, and I only saw one recent call to an out-of-state number. Being into electronics, I went into the settings to see what kind of operating system it had. It was vastly out of date on software, and still set in some variation of the Lollipop OS. That's alright, I thought. I could still flip it for a quick $10 or so. I placed it on the bed next to the laptop, and sat for a moment trying to take in what was in front of me. This was such a great find, but I needed to power on the laptop and see what I was working with. To my excitement, there was no login screen. I was in, immediately after booting it up. I was never as into laptops as I was with phones, but I could tell right away I was not working with your standard stock operating system. This thing resembled more of a modeled setup that I had seen kids working with back in high school, but I couldn't name it off the top of my head. Luckily, it was simple enough to navigate. I set it up with my Wi-Fi and dived right into the file storage to get an idea of whose computer I had. I was disappointed, for just a few moments later, I did find a folder labeled A. Inside was one JPG titled 1 by 1. Intrigued, my stomach did a little flip as I opened the image up. I was puzzled by what I found. It was a screenshot from a website. It looked like a post in some forum from a user named Anon4, with nothing but a phone number listed and 0 replies. Underneath the list was a tagline, "You know who you are." Scanning the image for an answer, I noticed the address bar for the site. It seemed to be a nonsense string of characters followed by a .onion extension. Onion? Wasn't that a parody news site or something? I wasn't too sure, but I decided to dig a little deeper. I click on the little X at the top, taking me back to the desktop. That's when I noticed another folder. This one was labeled Pics, which stirred up some more thrill in my bones. Yes, I cheered to myself. This would more than likely reveal the owner's identity. I became disappointed as I clicked through the pictures. There was no human life, just shots of different places and scenery. This included a dark image of a barber shop, a path in the woods somewhere, and even someone's garage. What really caught my eye was the last pic. It was the cafe. My stomach started doing acrobatics now, my heart racing. Why was there random pictures in this thing? Why was there a screenshot of a message board with a list of phone numbers? The files just weren't adding up for me, but I hatched a half-baked plan. I didn't know if it was going to end the mystery, but I couldn't help but pry. I pulled up the pic with the phone numbers, grabbed the Android phone, and dialed the first number at the top of the list. After only 2 rings, I was greeted with silence. Strange, I thought. But I pressed on, and I dialed the next number on the list. This time, it rang 5 times before I got a generic inbox greeting with the phone number listed. Interesting, but I hung up before I heard the beep. I grew bored of dialing the random numbers, and I decided to take a break and put the laptop and cell phone away for a little while. I knew I'd come back to it later. Once the evening rolled around, I waited for my parents to go to bed, then fixed myself up a snack. This was pretty much a nightly routine of mine. I clicked on the TV as I usually did, and settled on the first news channel I scrolled to. This is when things took a turn for the weird. A breaking news story was displayed on screen, one from the next town over. Young barber, age 25, found murdered at work. Damn, I shook my head. That sucks. A female news reporter was on the scene outside the barbershop where it took place. Wait a second. I couldn't believe my eyes. That barbershop. It was the same one from the picture on the laptop. I was sure of it. I put my plate down on the coffee table and raced upstairs to grab the computer. I booted it up, clicked on the folder of pictures, and then the photo in question, ran back downstairs with laptop in hand, and held it up to a TV screen. Yup, it was definitely the barbershop. Wow, what were the chances of that? I was shaking my head in amazement. I finished watching the news story and began feeling tired. I was about to ready myself for bed, so I grabbed the remote. The news story just after grabbed my attention before I could hit the power button. Cold murder in local forest. This one was also nearby, just over the bridge in the opposite direction. This world is terrible, I thought. I hadn't seen two stories like that back to back in a long time. That's when it hit me. I scrolled over to the picture of the woods in the same folder. Then I waited to see if the news story included the location of the homicide on video. Though I didn't get anything solid to compare it to, I was definitely getting weird vibes. First a barbershop, now a forest? I had to be grasping at straws though, right? And I decided it was bedtime. I had a pretty restless night of sleep, tossing, turning, kicking my covers at the foot of the bed. It was hot and humid, and I kept waking up with the sweats. Needless to say, I was in dire need of a coffee the next morning. I was probably smart to leave the strange laptop at home, grabbing my own equipment as I headed out the door and drove rather quickly to the cafe, eyelids still heavy. I got my regular coffee and sat down at my favorite booth in the corner. Only one other person resided in the building, apart from the baristas at work. It was nice and quiet and felt peaceful. A good contrast from my evening snack and sweaty night of interrupted rest. Still, my mind couldn't help but wonder. The web address from the screenshot I found came rolling to the forefront of my thoughts. What was the Onion domain all about? Why did the web address make no sense? It was something like code in flux with random numbers and symbols after it. This was meaningless to me, and I decided it was time to do some research. I couldn't recall the exact website, but I remembered the .onion extension, so I started from there, and was immediately blown away. Apparently, what it pertains to is web addresses not reachable on normal servers. It takes you through something called Tor, and is used for some pretty shady activities. I guess it involves what's called the dark web. I'd heard a little about this before. I was beginning to feel sick. The websites on the wiki were pretty revolting to say the least. Nothing I would ever want to be involved in. The worst part? I was beginning to think the laptop I found was used solely to access this part of the internet. I couldn't bear the thought of being in possession of it any longer. I had to do something. I stormed out the cafe, ready to spring into action, when I was stopped by a tap on my leg. I looked down to see a homeless man looking back, in a black, tattered leather jacket, sitting up against the front of the building. His face looked rough, complete with a badly shaven beard and cracked lips. He looked miserable. He held out a small plastic cup, looking up at me with desperation in his eyes. "Spare change, sir?" "I'm in a hurry, dude. Don't got any cash." "Please," he begged some more, and reached out and grabbed my pant leg. No, get away from me! I kicked his hand away. The guy looked upset. His eyes were actually watering a little bit, and I did feel a little bad. But damn, don't grab me. That's when this guy did the strangest thing. He took out a phone and started taking pictures of me. What are you doing now? I asked, confused as hell. He didn't answer. All I could do about it was run to my car and leave as fast as possible. What was this guy's deal? I called my friend Peter on my way home. I knew he would have some more insight onto this whole thing. I was hoping I could bring him to my house and have him wipe the computer clean. Then I could sell it to a random Yahoo and be done with this whole misadventure. Once I picked up my friend, I sped back to my house and showed him what I had found in the cafe. He was blown away. This thing is lethal, he laughed. It looks pretty customized, honestly. Yeah, I noticed that, but take a look at this. I clicked through the photos showing him the ones, and I compared them to the local news stories. So you think this laptop has some connection to the murders? I don't know, man, but I think there's something fishy going on here. He shrugged and took over the mouse for a moment. Where are the pictures and phone numbers? It's somewhere in the file storage. Yup, click there and bingo. Peter stared intensely at the list and address bar in the screenshot. He also checked the file description and saw that the screenshot originated from the laptop, so it was taken from within the device. My hairs were at attention, all up and down my skin. So you tested these numbers out? Yeah, with this phone. I handed him the cell phone that came in the bag with the laptop, and he scanned through it rapidly. Definitely a track phone, something bought as a burner, possibly for some sort of business task. Should we try another phone number? I nodded and pointed to one just below the phone numbers I'd tested out. He dialed it in and threw it on speakerphone so that we could both listen. It rang and didn't stop ringing, so we hung up after the 8th ring. Peter looked at the phone funnier, then said, I honestly don't know what's up with all of this. Do you want me to just factory reset everything? Yeah, I mean, is that gonna take care of my problem? Not sure, but I think I'd like to have some fun with this before we call it a day. I gave him a look, a glance of disagreement. I didn't think that would be in our best interests. I don't think we should be messing with this dude. Come on, what could go wrong? You could even film it, this could go viral. Well, I'm not gonna vlog me hanging around with a stolen laptop, so just do what you gotta do and move on. Peter smirked, looked at the screen again, and then dialed another number from the list. Again, we got nothing. This time, just another generic voice box greeting. He continued on to the next phone number. Halfway through dialing, he stopped. His eyes were scanning the screen. His face was now as white as a ghost. What? Why'd you stop? You okay? This is my phone number. My heart panged like a club to a gong. That can't be. I scooted over next to Peter and observed the screen. He was right. Just to be sure, he finished dialing and hit send. He put his phone up to his ear and waited. Just as he suspected, his pocket lit up and his ringtone sang away. We both looked at each other in shock. Dude. My hands were shaking, and my mouth was agape so far I think my jaw was brushing my bedsheets. How? Is all Peter could muster up from his racing thoughts. This is unreal. I don't like this at all. Just wipe the hard drive and let's be done with it. Wait, he shouted, while looking at the screen again. My heart sank some more. and I had a feeling about what he was about to say. What? Don't tell me. He didn't say a word. All he did was start dialing another number. That's when I felt it. My pocket was now vibrating. That's when I felt it. My pocket was now vibrating. I gulped so loud that I flinched. I reached down and pulled out my phone and answered. I held it up to my ear. "Peter?" I said through the receiver, looking at my visibly shaken friend across the room from me. "This is messed up," he responded through the burner phone. I ended up driving Peter home shortly after. He handed the phone over and told me he wanted to leave and take everything in. He left the laptop with me and told me he'd rather not mess with it. We decided to meet up at the cafe and drop it back off right next morning. We'd wake up early and hopefully be the first ones in. However, I missed my alarm. Apparently, I'd also missed 10 calls from Peter. I opened my last messages and noticed the 4 texts he'd sent me. Damn, I had to get going and fast. I had already packed up everything the night before, so all I really had to do was now throw on a t-shirt, shorts, and head to the cafe. As I turned the corner to where the cafe was, I had to hit the brakes pretty quickly. What I saw on the road was nothing but cops and ambulances. There were roadblocks set up on either side of the ambulances, and the cafe was barricaded. What in the... I was thinking out loud. This was crazy. There were people with their hands over their faces looking scared and sad. I pulled over into the grocery store parking lot across the street and then walked over to the scene to get a closer look. I assumed Peter was doing the same. I ended up in a crowd of onlookers next door, looking at the scene before us. There was blood splattered on the front doors of the cafe, and some papers, along with other belongings strewn about. More blood covered the ground. Jesus, this was a damn massacre. I could hear the people beside me whispering to each other about what was going on. "They're talking about a possible serial killer," one woman said to her friend. "The kids were about to walk in, and suddenly bullets came in from over there. No one saw who fired the shots." A guy filled in his wife about what he witnessed. I was too curious to just be craning my neck from back there. I needed a closer look. I peered over at the cops who were busy questioning a barista by the ambulances. I crept past the barricade slowly and slipped past a few other baristas and made my way to a second ambulance by the other barricade. The stretcher was now in full view, but I couldn't tell who was in it. I decided to kneel down beside the ambulance and hopefully catch some conversation between the EMTs. I took up my phone and started recording. We lost him. He wasn't hanging in there much when we got here, but I was hoping... "Jan, it's not your fault. You saved the girl. You can't save them all, you know." "I wish I could. I heard him talk before he left, you know. He told me his name was Peter." My hands jumped up over my mouth as I let out the weirdest sound. It was a gasp combined with a grunt of disbelief. "No, it couldn't be." "Yeah," the other EMT said. "We have his information already. Guess he was an IT guy for a local business. Smart kid, early 20s. I stumbled back a bit on my heels, dropping my phone in the process. I bumped into something solid behind me and stood up quickly. I turned around and saw the same homeless guy from the other day. My face was still contorting from the information I had just received from my eavesdropping. The guy was just staring at me, stoic. He didn't even react to me bumping into him. He was glaring at me from behind an unchanging expression. I couldn't help it. I booked it across the street to my car. I could feel tears forming in my ducts, eyes twitching in the wind from my open driver's side window. Why did I have to wake up so late? Maybe Peter would have been spared from whatever this was. A drive-by? An assassination of some kind? My head was dizzy. My heart was hurting. But I was beginning to make some connections. The pictures on the computer, the phone numbers, the murders, everything. I was getting an idea as to what it was I was dealing with. The stuff about the dark web, the strange laptop, the phone numbers. I arrived home, heart sick as hell. My friend was murdered today, and I couldn't stop it. Maybe if I had never grabbed the computer from the cafe, he'd still be alive. Maybe, if I hadn't have been so stupid, I could have handled this whole thing differently and he wouldn't be dead right now. To top it all off, I realized I left my phone at the bloody scene. I groaned and threw my head back to the driver's seat. Now what? Well, the phone is near some cops and the EMTs. Maybe if I call, they'll believe I dropped it before they got there and I won't get in trouble. I reached back and grabbed the burner phone out of my bag and started to dial my phone number when I suddenly had a thought. If the phone numbers we dialed somehow had something to do with the murders, that must mean... I grabbed the laptop out of the bag, my heart racing and body profusely sweating in fear. This whole thing was unreal. The fact that I was right in the middle of it was even worse. I clicked on the folder of pictures of scenery from earlier. Again, my eyes scrolled across the pictures of the barbershop, then the forest. Finally, my eyes got to the picture of the cafe. Yes, the phone numbers and these locations had to have somehow been tied together, but I didn't know how. Why was this happening? I was about to leave the folder, but then a smaller thumbnail at the end of the list of pictures caught my eye. I hovered over the cursor and opened it up. With some cloud service, the image was revealed. My jaw dropped in utter horror. A picture of my house. I was looking at an image of my front yard and home. I hadn't noticed this before. Why hadn't I noticed this before? Over in the top corner was a link that once opened up the full cloud folder from some email made up of more gibberish characters. This folder contained more pics that were very different from the others. No way, I shouted out loud, my face contorted in anger and fear at once. Pictures of me looking directly at the camera, others of my car. The last ones were of me sneaking into the crime scene at the cafe. That guy. That homeless-looking guy from the other day and behind the ambulance. I have his laptop. He was watching me. How did he tie in into these murders? My silent tirade was interrupted by the sudden sound of a jingle to my right. The phone was ringing in my passenger seat. I picked it up and peered at the phone number. I couldn't handle this anymore. I couldn't take it. It was my own phone number. Grudgingly, I decided to swipe and answer the call. Who is this? I stammered. A gravelly voice answered from the other end. Spare some change, sir? Earlier this year, during the spring, my wife had planned a trip with an older woman who she befriended. They had been friends even before I first met my wife. She had mentioned to me before that her friend was a witch and routinely performed rituals with animal limbs. I don't know anything about witches, to be honest, but what I experienced leads me to believe that she's bad news. I've yet to meet her in person, but strange things have happened after she visited our apartment. My wife's friend drove to our apartment early one Thursday morning so that they could carpool to their destination. I work during the afternoon and into the night, so her knocking woke me up. My wife was already awake and greeted her at the door. They had a brief conversation in the living room and were on their way. After they left, I had a hard time returning to sleep, so I tried to kill some time on my phone. It was just after 9 a.m. when I felt some unusual vibrations underneath my bed. I was confused at first and thought I was experiencing an earthquake. The vibration then turned into what I can only describe as someone kicking my mattress from underneath it. I sat up in bed and carefully observed other objects in the room to see if they were also shaking and to see if this really was an earthquake. Nothing else in the room was affected. No later than 10 seconds after sitting up, I felt my king-sized mattress come up off the bed frame about 2 to 3 inches and lightly lean from left to right. After that, the mattress settled back on the frame. My body became unusually warm, and I was too scared to jump out of bed, fearing something would grab my ankles as soon as I touched the floor. Just about 20 minutes ago, this happened to me. I'm running express checkouts and playing Pokemon Go, so I'm walking kind of slow through the hotel. I had a lot of notes about disruptive rooms, so I was trying to stay quiet to listen in order to hear people being rowdy. I'm rounding the corner on the second floor and see an older man dressed in black pants, shoes, long-sleeve shirt, and seemed to be elderly, but I only saw his white hair from the back. He was walking in the opposite direction towards the staircase at the end of the hall really slowly, which led me to believe he was even more elderly than I thought. I really didn't want to talk to him because it's 2:30 in the morning and it's quiet hours, so I slowed my pace a little bit. I only had one more room to give the express checkout, so I got down near the end of the hall and slipped it under the door. I was close enough that I could see into the stairwell, so both up and down the staircases. I was about 3 doors down, not far at all, and I noticed him standing just outside the doorway. As I got closer, he started moving to go upstairs, so I figured he heard me, or saw me, and was also feeling antisocial. I was going downstairs, so no harm in walking at normal speed. I got to the last section of the doors, and he's walking very slowly up the stairs. He was only on the 4th or 5th step, and I get closer to the door to the stairwell, and then it slams shut. I jump, because not only was it loud and unexpected, but also our doors have the thing on top that slows it down so it doesn't slam. My reflexes kicked in. I rush to open the door and see what's going on, with about 5 to 10 seconds max between all of this happening. I open the door, and the man is nowhere to be found. I look up the staircase and there wasn't a guy in sight. I got to the first landing to investigate more, and I see the guy turn the corner at the opposite end of the hall, a good 40 to 50 yards at the other end. There's no human way possible for someone to get to the bottom of the staircase on the 2nd floor, all the way to the opposite end of the hall on the next floor up in the few seconds it took me to see him. Even if it wasn't an elderly man, it's still impossible, and I would have heard footsteps if he were running. He even turned the corner, still walking very slowly. My hair is standing on end. I just hope for the sake of the guests that he's not some evil spirit or something. Freaked me right out. This happened in my childhood and teen years, back when I was living in Venezuela. I am now 29 years old and living in the United Kingdom. My parents are originally from Portugal, but immigrated to Venezuela looking for a better life. We lived in a massive apartment complex with over 30 different apartments. My mum was close friends with a couple of neighbors from the ground floor as we lived on the third. These two neighbors were brother and sister. The brother lived alone with a husky, while the sister lived with her two sons who were really good friends of mine. Now it's important to point out that the sister was a divorced mum, whose ex-partner was a very wealthy truck company owner. She had everything paid for by her ex-partner, from the apartment she lived in to daily groceries and anything she needed. After all, she was bringing up his two sons. Now, ever since I can remember, my mum and the sister would always light-heartedly joke about a ghostly apparition they named Francisco. I must preface by saying that I have neither recollection or don't think I ever have seen Francisco myself, but recall them saying he was a smartly dressed man with a moustache that was always seen walking around the apartment complex. I recall multiple times where my mum and or sister would point out that they could see Francisco, and I was not able to see him myself. Now, Francisco appeared to be a friendly ghost, and was never threatening to anyone. However, Francisco's presence was mainly felt in the brother's apartment, who lived right next to his sister. The brother always used to joke that he and Francisco were roommates and never felt threatened by him. He used to tell us that at night he could hear Francisco running around the house, opening closets and cabinet doors, and that he was so active that he would yell at him to shut up and take a shower and watch TV. He would then either hear all the taps in the bathroom open and or the TV turning on. Multiple times throughout my childhood, I recalled playing with their sons in the corridor and hearing loud noises coming from the brother's apartment when there was no one there. Whether that be furniture clashing, doors opening and shutting, to loud sounds of glass and plates being smashed. Most of the time, we would inform the sister who would check the apartment and confirm that everything was fine. This continued for a few years, with nothing major to mention apart from the above. Suddenly, the activity began to increase, with a lot more apparitions and the brother mentioning that Francisco was a lot more restless and active than usual. His own husky would cower in the corner when in the house, terrified of being alone. And this is the first time weird things started to happen. The sister would be involved in a massive car crash, where she was lucky to come out alive. The eldest of her sons fell down a huge flight of stairs, breaking his leg and cracking a few ribs. And finally, her mum came to visit her and her sons for a few days. She was around 50 years old and healthy. One evening, while sitting at home with her daughter and grandsons, she had a sudden heart attack and passed away. This shocked everyone, as she had no reports of heart issues and had been completely fine up until that moment. Things went back to normal in the following weeks. Shortly after that, my parents decided to move to another city, and I completely forgot about Francisco and the things that happened. Years later, the sister and brother also moved out, but something surprising happened. It was common knowledge that Francisco lived with her brother, or at least, that's where he was most active. But Francisco tagged along following the move. He went with the sister rather than the brother. Now, most of this has been told to me by my mum, as she kept in close contact with the sister. But from what she remembers, it's that following the move, Francisco started going absolutely crazy in the new house. From cabinet doors and shelves opening and closing frantically, to objects being thrown around the house. The sister had been harmed a few times by scratches along her back, and almost every night the duvet would be pulled off while she slept. It got to the point where the sister and her sons would sleep in the same bedroom, and pray every night for it to stop. One day, deciding that they couldn't live like this anymore, a priest was brought into the house and did a blessing. Immediately following the blessing of the house, her kitchen caught fire, but thankfully it was contained to just that area. The cause of the fire was determined to be a candle that was lighted to a cross of Jesus Christ. Now, the only way this would have caused a fire was if someone would have tipped it over intentionally. However, there was no one home and the windows were closed, so this was obviously blamed on Francisco. Around the same time, her youngest son was caught in a crossfire between the police and local gang, but he managed to get away from it unscathed. Following this, the sister and her ex-partner decided to speak with a local witch who dealt with white magic. The witch came to the house and immediately began to speak with Francisco out loud. It turns out the reason he was smartly dressed was because he was a dentist when alive and always liked to keep up appearances. He also died young, was buried at 30, and apparently someone had performed black magic using the earth from his grave and brought him back to the world of the living with one task: take one life with him every 10 years. The first life he took was the grandmother 10 years earlier, and it was coming up to the 20-year mark. It was the reason he was a lot more active and the weird things started happening again. But above all, he wanted to rest in peace. The witch managed to contain him to a jar and take him with her, with the promise he will have a proper burial and will be able to rest in peace. He was apparently temporarily released in her backyard, which he went absolutely crazy on, smashing things and breaking windows before being buried and put to rest. Now, it has been theorized by my mum and the sister that this could have only been done by the new wife of the sister's ex-partner. She hated the sister and her sons because they were living off her husband and both had multiple raging arguments, cursing each other and wishing death on the other. The sister believes the new wife must have spread the cursed dirt on one of her pot plants when she came to visit with her ex-partner. It's a long story, but one I always use when someone claims to not believe in the paranormal. I love having my mum tell the story and seeing the look on their face. I've been a hotel night auditor for 8.5 years without much trouble. The hotel where I work, night auditors always work alone, unless we were training someone new. We always lock our front entrance automated doors at midnight. One night around 1 a.m. a guy comes to the door. I called the entrance phone and ask how I can help him. He says that he needs to rent a room, so I buzz him in. He comes to the counter and asks the rate. When I tell him the price, he asks if he can use the restroom. He comes back and insists he needs water. I tell him where the faucet is, which is right next to the restroom that he just used. By this time, I think he's gonna rob me. I feel like telling him just to rob me to get it over with, and he comes back from getting water and asks if he can use the phone. He can't work the hotel phone because you have to dial 9 for an outside line, and that confuses him. So I dial the number for him, and my hands are shaking so badly that I have to try and dial it a few times. Instead of asking him the number, I write it down, and when I finally get it right, there's no answer on the other line. Then, this guy leaves. I swear to myself that I will not open the doors for anyone else tonight. And around 4 a.m. a different guy comes to the door and asks if he can use the phone. I'm not opening it for anyone, so I ask the number, and I go to call it, and I realize it's the same number the first guy gave me. I can only see one person standing in front of all the glass doors, but I hear someone coughing, and it's not the guy I'm talking to. I know something is up, and instead of calling the number, I call the cops. 5 minutes later, 2 cop cars pull up. The first guy runs into the woods, and the second guy is still in the entrance, unable to run. The cop comes in to let me know what's going on. Earlier that night, there was a big fight at a trailer park down the road, and these guys were involved, and the police have been looking for them all night. People were hurt pretty bad because of these guys. The 2 guys had to get away and had no phone, so they were trying to make a call for a ride out of town. If they would have been upfront with me from the beginning about needing to use the phone instead of freaking me out, they might have gotten away. I work with a guy from Mexico, and he used to tell me crazy stories about the country. The one that scares me the most is the one about the white dress witch. While in Mexico, he said every year, once a year around 3 in the morning, he would wake up and in the corner of his room he would see a lady in white. He would be so freaked out that he couldn't do anything except stare and cry at her. So after he told me that, I told him, yeah, right. Then he told me he saw her in the back of our chemical plant on graveyards at 3 in the morning. Again, I shook it off until I had to go back there and mess with some dryers. As I was walking back, I look back and I see white sheets flowing in the wind. So I stopped, and that's when I realized it was a lady in a dress with white hair. I didn't think I'd ever run so fast in my entire life. Of course, when I got back to the shift, I told them what I saw, and no one believed me except my friend from Mexico. Ever since then, I've been seeing more and more weird and unusual things in the plant, and now my home. I used to be a duty manager at a 250-bed hotel in the UK. It was built on the Seafront in 1828. I would often sit with the girls on the front desk in the evenings if I wasn't busy, mostly because they were nice, and also because the place, despite being beautiful, was creepy as hell at night. The elevator would often ding, open up, and go up and down and stop by itself. It was always perfect when the engineer came to look at it though. There were often reports from guests that a dog was running in the halls, always the same description, and it would disappear. Someone came down from their room telling us a man was there, and we had to send someone up to make sure. They switched rooms. New waiting staff would often approach a woman in the dining hall looking out to see, for her to disappear before they got to her. Part of my job was to do the security/fire checks. I had to tour the building's dark basements with a flashlight. In the basement, there are arched rooms that were once used for storage linens, cleaning materials and foods. They looked like empty little prison cells now. Luckily, the maintenance men would escort me around most nights. It was spooky. My grandfather used to be the equivalent of a ranger down in Mexico. He was in charge of patrolling the farms and lands, mainly due to people growing weed. One day he said he was patrolling this ranch late at night, during the night shift, and he heard a baby crying. Now the land is pretty flat, so he looks everywhere and saw nothing. Maybe it was some goats out in the distance. They sound like crying babies sometimes, and as he's walking his route, he hears the same sound, looks up in the sky, and he swears he saw a witch, with black clothes and everything, flying towards a mountain. He panicked, ran to his car, and drove off as fast as he could. Personally, I don't believe him, and my family thought he was high. I was sitting in my office drinking coffee when I noticed my co-workers running to the break room. Fearing something 9/11, I joined them to see that there was an active shooter at Norfolk Middle School. I dropped my coffee on the floor as someone turned to me and said, "Doesn't your son David?" Everything went silent. I didn't even notice that hot coffee splashing on my ankles or the clamor of my co-workers shuffling around me. The television showed me everything I never wanted to see. I didn't get any work done. I spent the rest of the day in the break room staring at the television. It was around the time someone called me to tell me that the phone in my office was ringing off the hook. I feared for the worst call as I shuffled back to my desk. I picked up the receiver and listened in horror as the voice said, "Mrs. Sullivan? We regret to inform you that your son David..." I dropped the phone. It was all too much. David was only 13 years old, and like that, he was gone. For the next few weeks, it was a blur. I buried my son. My husband drifted deeper into a bottle of vodka to avoid looking at me. My son had been dead 3 weeks before another school shooting happened, and the reporters stopped calling as often. It was just the latest in the long line of tragedies that fueled the 24-hour news cycle. It had been a month by the time I had finally worked up the nerve to walk into my son's room. It was therapeutic to clean his room. At the same time, I had to take a break to sob as I realized no one would be stuffing empty bags of Doritos into bottles of Mountain Dew and hiding them under his bed. I sat on his dirty floor and slammed my hands against the side of his computer. The cover fell off, and I found on the inside a piece of paper that were his passwords. I decided to then climb onto my son's computer chair and begin digging through his online life. His Facebook was little more than an assortment of groups where kids his age shared memes and laughed about Slavic men squatting in tracksuits. I didn't get the joke, but it was something he seemed to post about often. I was about to shut his computer down when I found a folder named Death Not Pose Law on his computer. It was inside of this folder that I found a series of icons, of which one looked like an onion. I gave it a double click, and it pulled up an IRC client. I was prompted for a password. I looked through his passwords and found one that had the same name as the folder I'd found the RIC client in. I typed the password and was logged into a channel called #HiredGuns. The speaker made a loud ding noise, and the windows started flashing on the taskbar. I had received a private message from someone named Jeff TK. It read, "Your request has been fulfilled, Death Not Pose Law. The target at Norfolk Middle School has been terminated. Payment has not been received. You do not want to owe us money." I replied, "You sick sacks of shit. My son died in that shooting. You think this is funny?" I was kicked from the RIC channel and disconnected from the server. I tried to log back in and received a message that read, "Connection refused. User has been banned." I spent the rest of the night reading through every chat log and text file on my son's computer. I read about how a group of kids at his school had been teasing him. I read about how he had been spending all of his free time on something called the dark web. He talked about how he'd scraped enough Bitcoin together to pay the first half of a payment needed to hire a contract killer. It was around that time that I found the folder where my son stored all his nude selfies and videos. I threw up in my mouth as I found out in vivid detail that my 13-year-old son was performing live camera shows for creepy men for Bitcoin, so he could fund his whole murder/suicide plot. As I read through the last of his hidden diary in the Def Not Pose Law folder, I stared at the monitor in front of me. It was at that time that I noticed a green LED light on the top of the monitor. It was flashing under a post-it note. I pulled it away and a notepad window opened up. I sat there as someone typed out the line. "Your son owed us $5,000. We will contact you with an account number where you can transfer the funds. If you call the police, we will end everyone you love." I reached down and pulled the plug from the back of the computer. It was too much to take in. My David had lived a very secretive life online. Knowing what I knew, I had no idea how to proceed. I had never considered the possibility that my son was responsible for the shooting. What floored me though was knowing he had set it up so that he had to die in the shooting. That night, I joined my husband as I poured myself a glass of vodka and stared into the distance. I had a lot to consider as I went forward. There was an encrypted drive on my son's computer, and I had the passwords. The more I think about this, the more I realize that I completely failed as a parent. I spent the next 3 days going through my son's computer offline. I learnt a lot. He kept a detailed journal. 6 students and 3 staff members died in the shooting. With the exception of my son, I think every single one of them deserved what they got. The students had been bullying my son. The teachers had been turning a blind eye to the abuse. However, the school counselor was the worst of the bunch. John Garrett had been counseling my son online. David kept logs of all of his DMs. It didn't take much reading to find out that Mr. Garrett was grooming my son for a different kind of abuse. John Garrett had manipulated my son into performing lewd acts on webcam. This repulsive individual had convinced my son that it would build his self-esteem. What started with nude selfies or the occasional cam show turned into David performing on live streams for rooms full of anonymous sickos who would tip him with Bitcoin and other assorted cryptocurrencies. I accessed his Bitcoin wallet and found that these men had paid my son in excess of 4 Bitcoin. Feel free to check the conversion rate on that one. That was simply my son's cut. From reading the chat logs, I can only surmise that John Garrett was keeping the larger portion of the tips for himself. Somewhere along the way, a few students at his school figured out that my son was gay. Apparently, my son had expressed a crush on a local boy who did not share his affection. These idiot kids proceeded to push him into lockers or call him despicable things. When my son would bring the attention to his teachers, they would do nothing. This led to my son talking to John Garrett. If Jeff TK hadn't already seen his death, I'd have spent an evening or 2 peeling the skin from his penis with a potato peeler. If you haven't guessed already, I'm not posting these updates in real time. Over the course of the last few weeks, I have become a bitter woman. I have been using my son's Adderall to stay awake and my husband's vodka to take the edge off. I've already catalogued all of the information on my son's desktop. I used the funds from his Bitcoin wallet to produce a new laptop, and I've spent my days at home driving into the world John Garrett had introduced him to. Once I was fairly certain I had familiarized myself with enough of the details, I went back to that private IRC server with my own screen name. I messaged Jeff TK and asked for a QR code so that I could send him the remaining payment. No questions were asked, and I sent him the $5,000 my son owed him. What followed was a conversation that read like this. "So how does this work? Can I give you another list of names?" "A list of names for what?" replied Jeff TK. That's cute. My son was short-sighted. It didn't take me long to figure out most of his viewers were associates of John Garrett. We are well aware of that situation. How long did it take to have RAT on his system? Long enough. I assume you have 3 names for me? 4. 4? 4. Andrew Rubens, Sterling Rutherford, Malcolm Turner, and Glenn Wade. Who is Glenn Wade? Glenn Wade is a poster on Reddit who encouraged my son to end his own life. This will cost you more than you have. I'm sure we can work something out. I'm sure we can. 3 men who worked as school counselors at various local schools would be having a very bad week indeed. One internet troll would be having a very bad day. Even after dumping all of my son's cryptocurrency, I would still be in debt to these men for more than $10,000. I didn't care that people were going to die. Any sympathy I had for the world died with my son. No sooner than I had secured this deal, though, I received a phone call. I answered, and a very familiar voice said, "Mum, what have you done?" 3 weeks of hatred fell away as the tears poured from my eyes. I replied, "David, is that you?" "Why, Mum, why are you doing this?" David said in a concerned tone. I shot back, "They took you away from me, baby. I'm gonna make them pay for it in blood." I stared down at the cordless handset and realized that it was off. I had been awake for longer than a week. It was becoming harder and harder to distinguish what was real and what was just another hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. I stared at the handset and cried all over again. My son was gone. He had spent the last month of his life being violated and abused by those he supposed to trust in the world the most. Worst of all, instead of coming to me, he chose to end it. No one was going to come out of this sitting pretty. I popped 3 more pills and chased it with a mixture of Sprite and vodka. It wasn't long before I received a DM that read, "You ready to earn the rest of the money?" Happy endings are for children. We read about how the princess marries the prince and they live happily ever after. Ever after is a mortgage creeping towards default, and a husband that would rather spend the last of our savings getting drunk than deal with the fact our son died violently. I spent weeks looking for the answers, and any time I tried to explain all of these details, that drunk bastard would be nice enough to say, "That's nice, honey. Happily ever after my ass." I was 2 years into a degree in computer science when this strapping young lad literally carried me off to wedding bliss in a horse-drawn carriage. 6 months later, I gave birth to the most beautiful baby boy. We settled into a decent house because he had a decent job. By the time my son was in 1st grade, we even managed to move to the suburbs. No one cares. No one cares that my son is dead. If it isn't the sickos that drove him to end his own life, it's the shooting truthers who flood my voicemail telling me that I'm a crisis actor and that my son never existed. Each day the list gets a little longer. There are benefits to having a working relationship with a group of individuals that specialize in murder. Glenn Wade died screaming. I watched via livestream as he begged for death. Sterling Rutherford and Andrew Rubens got to bleed out after being force-fed their penises. Malcolm Turner got a bullet in the back of the head. I don't know how my son found these men, but I cannot help but love them for their work. Each day, the list gets a little longer. I've burned through my son's savings early. Contrary to what some of you may be thinking, I haven't been paying my debt through exhibitionism. That's the thing about our little community. The one my son stumbled across. It isn't so much that I'm hiring someone to end someone else. It's more of a bounty board. Men and women from all walks of life take jobs from the master list and people die. It's almost like your Craigslist, but for all manner of violent acts. Want someone to torture and end your high school gym teacher? There's a subsection for that. Want someone to end the life of a drunk that stopped showing up to work and ended up costing your company a crucial amount? Well, no one's gonna miss my idiot husband. It's amazing how easy it is to make it look like an alcoholic died in a single car accident. I think the most hilarious thing about all of this is that I started out looking to find justice for my son. Now, I cannot help but feel closer to him than I ever did when he was alive. It's easy to skate through life, believing that there's a point to it all. It is so much more fulfilling to realize that life is as worthless or as meaningful as you choose to make it. My son calls me on occasion. Whether it is actually him or just a warning sign that I'm putting too many amphetamines in my system, I don't care. We talk. He told me that he tried to tell my husband about everything. He told me that he was proud of me for avenging him. He told me that he loves me. My son loves me. He can rest now knowing I made sure everyone involved in making his life hell is now very dead. My son loves me. I love my son. It wasn't enough to end the people who drove him to such a convoluted suicide, though. It doesn't take a lot of work to scrub something from the internet. Getting rid of any trace that my son existed was easy. Of course, I used a fake name for my son's middle school when I posted the first part. I don't want you tracking me or him down. After I post this update, I'm likely to never log into this account again. I just wanted to warn you. The deep web, or whatever you want to call it, is where very scary people congregate. These people would soon screw you to death with power tools than ask you for your opinion. These are people that keep a jar of human thumbs on their computer desk and get off on old episodes of The Price is Right while wearing their grandmother's used adult diapers. These are people like me. It took me a while to find my niche. My husband was just the test run. However, with a few kills under my belt, I've more than made my way into the inner circle of our little club. You wouldn't believe how many people get angry over comments on Reddit. And that is the thing, people recycle usernames. You link your Reddit to your Discord and your Discord to your stream, and you make forum posts on various websites discussing your comings and goings. You check into a place on Facebook and leave your privacy settings at public. Anonymity is a myth. With the right tools and access to the right search utilities, anyone on the internet can be identified. So, this is it. My son is dead, his killer is dead, Jeff ended up on someone's list, and I'm sure eventually I'll end up on someone's list. But until then, my list keeps getting longer. If you're the kind of bully that hides behind a keyboard and terrorizes others with your bullshit opinion and your unwanted sense of entitlement, well, you never know when someone might offer up a bounty on your head. If you see me on the street, just nod, and I'll know. I'm 34, decent looking, and recently single. Heck, you might have already matched with me on Tinder. I've got a picture where I'm vaping and twirling a fidget spinner. I've got a decent gamer score on Xbox Live. Hell, I've even got a video on Instagram where I'm watching Rick and Morty with friends. And I've got 20 more profile pics with 20 more personalities. I'm out there, and I'm just waiting to see your name on my list. Hell hath no fury like a mother scorned. Ever since my childhood, it has been the family knowledge and joke, or inside secret, that there is a ghost of a witch living in my maternal grandmother's upstairs level. My older cousin, who is now in her 30s, claims she remembers seeing the ghost of the witch as a child, and from then on, even to this day, is still petrified of the stairwell and will not go up it for any reason. My slightly older cousin, who is now 20, says she has been terrified with the stories of seeing the witch for years. but she, like myself, was slightly more curious about it. A few years younger, I was raised with the same tales. She and I used to climb the stairs at night with all the lights out in hopes of being able to confront the ghost witch. It had all started with my grandmother sometime in the 80s. My grandmother, my mother and her siblings, and my late grandfather moved into this 2-story house in the early 80s. The house was under new construction when they purchased the house. My mother often boasts about how she was the one who picked the house. She was a child at the time, and she thought the unfinished house was beautiful. My grandmother and grandfather considered her opinion and gave it a look and ended up purchasing it. My grandmother has always been a person who believes in the paranormal. In her younger days, she played around with stuff like tarot and Ouija boards, but was never avid about it, just light stuff. Her interest in such things, though, spawned from learning about the heritage of the females in our family. They had been witches killed during the Salem witch trials. In fact, one of the very last witch hangings was held about 5 minutes from my current home. My grandmother's mother was always accused by the whole family of being a witch. This accusation may have had something to do with the fact that she was heavily abusive to my grandmother when she was young, fed her rat poison, beat the crap out of her on her wedding night, and constantly emotionally abused her. It has always been believed that her house was cursed. I only met this wicked woman about 3 times, and there was always something off about her. She could convince you that she was the sweetest old woman in the world, and hide how she abused her daughter and her husband. Naturally, when my grandmother found out we were descendants from witches, she considered the possibility of her mother being one more seriously. My grandmother moved her Ouija board and her tarot cards and her books about ghosts into the new house in the 80s, and only after a year or so did strange things begin to happen. My mother and grandmother both remember the first occasion of something strange. My grandmother was carrying a laundry basket up the stairs, and suddenly she could no longer continue up. She said that it was feeling like someone was standing in front of her, forceful as a wall and not allowing her to continue. She physically could not continue up the stairs, and she said that the force felt cold and hot at the same time. My mother says she remembers my grandmother trying her hardest to push against it, but not being allowed through. My grandmother calmly said, "All right, let me through," and the force disappeared. It terrified my mother, and she said it was chilling how calm my grandmother was about it. My grandmother would often have her girlfriends over for tea at her house, as it's rather large, with 2 living rooms and decorative old-fashioned charm. It's similar to a small mansion, and she has quite a collection of tea and antique pots and cups. One tea party in the afternoon, though, would be the first visual sighting of the ghost of the witch. She was having tea with a few of her friends, all ladies, when one of the ladies looked up and over to my grandmother's shoulder. She smiled at something behind her and returned her eyes to my grandmother and asked, "Who's your other guest? I've never met her." My grandmother thought someone else had showed up, but she'd not invited anyone else. She turned around and saw that nothing was there. Her friends then began convincing my grandmother that they weren't crazy. They'd all seen her and described her as an old lady, with long, wavy grey hair that's messy, in a dirty dress with the saddest, most confused-looking expression on her face. Though she found it quite interesting, and she did believe her friends, she remained calm about this experience as well. Those girlfriends of hers suddenly no wanted to come over to her house anymore. My grandfather passed away, and several years later my grandmother remarried. Neither of them ever experienced anything or felt off in the house. None of the men who ever entered the house felt or saw anything at all, and some of the men are skeptics and some are believers. But regardless, none of them saw anything. It seemed the ghost of the witch would only present herself to the women of family or women visitors. Given our heritage, it would make sense. My grandmother, who is still haunted by this ghost witch, has never had an explanation as to why everyone began regarding her as the witch. She simply said that she felt the lady was a witch. My oldest cousin, the one who is now 30, was the second one to visually see this ghostly lady. She was a teenager when she saw it, about to be 20. She was alone in the house on Christmas night, while everyone sat outside in the large garage. The family often sat out there when they smoked and spent hours in there. My cousin claimed that she was going up the stairs to use the bathroom, too embarrassed to use the one on the second floor. She didn't feel like turning the light on and just carefully walked up, guided by the light of the downstairs Christmas tree. It was then that she said she saw an old woman with a sorrowful expression and long wavy grey hair walk slowly past her at the top of the stairs. She walked her way into the computer room, which was once my mother's bedroom. It's currently, and was when my cousin had her experience, a room full of mirrors and antiques, and my great-grandmother's belongings. My cousin said the old lady walked to that room and she refused to climb the stairs to investigate. She ran out of the house, crying to her father that there was a ghost. He didn't believe her and laughed it off. She was plagued with nightmares for the longest time and currently refuses to go anywhere near the stairwell. After these occasions with the witch, she became a household name, and my older cousin and I were raised on the spooky tales. This was one of the many things that has embedded a fascination with the paranormal and the morbid into my mind from a young age. My grandmother would tell only the young ladies of the house these stories, as the men thought she was crazy regardless of their beliefs on the paranormal, simply because they had never seen anything in the house. My grandmother told my older cousin and I the story of the night that one of her taxidermied birds came back to life for a few minutes. My grandmother and her new husband were both avid hunters and went duck hunting often, as well as fishing in ponds at nighttime. They had their best catch stuffed by a taxidermist and placed in a glass box. The stuffed bird sat atop in a cabin in the computer room, the one the witch apparently walked to. She said that she and her husband were asleep one night when they were startled awake by a loud sound. The sound was of hundreds of birds chirping and screeching and flying. They thought that some birds had hatched in their attic and gotten stuck inside, so that was the first place she checked. Nothing was inside. Though not a single bird, the sound continued, and it seemed to be coming from no specific place. She couldn't locate the sound, so she went to open the computer room door, and when she did, deafening silence fell all over the house, and not a single chirp could be heard. She found the taxidermy bird on the floor, the glass box busted into tiny crystals on the floor. This story and the infamous witch story led my curious cousin and I to venture into the computer room as many times as we could. My oldest cousin called us crazy, but we were curious and brave. We only liked to go up at night, because it created a better ambience and we felt like we had a better chance of seeing something terrifying for ourselves. We played with antique mirrors, dug through old wooden trunks in search of my grandmother's Ouija board, and did ghost chants and witch spells that we found online. When that got boring and came with no results, we got on Microsoft Word and wrote murder mystery stories. We'd write the most gore-filled story we could imagine, and then print it out on my grandmother's printer and hide several copies of it around the house to creep people out. Sometimes the very old desktop computer would take control of itself and start searching for things on its own. We witnessed it type in a series of confusing codes and numbers and then pull up various pictures of headstones and scroll quickly through them. We didn't scream and run out, as our oldest cousin would have. We simply watched in silence. the computer abruptly shutting off, and our only fear was that we would get in trouble for breaking my grandmother's computer. The lights would turn on and off in the room, not as if flickering though. They turned off and on dutifully, as if someone was doing it on purpose. Strange sounds came from the floor, like scratching and bumping, and the mirror always seemed to be in a different spot every time we turned around to look at it. Books fell off shelves, and the other, newer computer kept on the other side of the room would fire up by itself. Before my older cousin and I could ever really delve into the witch story, she grew up. She was only a few years older than me, but her interest turned to boys and being popular in school. She had her first slide phone and stopped paying me any attention at all. We'd once been so close, but her own social standards forced us apart, and she rarely spoke to me. She was rarely mean to me, but she acknowledged me only on holidays. She evolved into a preppy popular girl while I spiraled into a paranormal-obsessed young teenager who scoured the internet for gore and supernatural. And I still ventured on my own now, into that computer room upstairs. My fascination for the paranormal was far deeper than that of my cousins. Hers had just been a phase. Mine has been my entire life. Both sides of my family believe in ghosts, and each have stories of their own experiences. The only skeptic, surprisingly, is my mother. She does admit, though, that she only doesn't believe because she tries not to, because she's scared to. My father, on the other hand, was my biggest supplier of creepy stories, and he always told me, if you go looking for something, you'll find it sooner or later. Because he knew how badly I wanted to explore ghosts, so I never stopped looking in my grandmother's house. My great-grandmother, nearly 102 years old at the time, was placed in a nursing home because her house couldn't be afforded and all the money was going into the nursing home and the house to the state. There was an occasion where the family was invited to go collect some things from her house, anything that we liked, because they were going to get thrown away. I went and took some creepy old dolls from the 20s, and my mother took some sentimental items. When I was in my great-grandmother's bedroom alone, staring into the large Victorian mirror of hers, chills rushed through me, and I leaped when I saw a shadow dart behind me. I turned around and searched for what had made the shadow, but a strong smell of garlic and burning wood dizzled me and forced me to leave the room. The presence felt sad and angry at the same time. My aunt, who had more business knowledge than any of us at the time, was helping my grandmother close the probate on the house. It was her job to keep the house in good condition, so she had to visit it alone frequently. On the last day of having to go inside, she went in to take the items that she wanted from the estate, a vintage lamp that reminded her of her 70s childhood. She took the lamp and bid the house and relieved farewell. She locked it up behind her, and suddenly a massive bolt of lightning struck the yard just in front of her. The rain began to pour and the wind began to howl, blackened clouds bruising the sky above her, making a great rage of a storm. She quickly tried to unlock the house, but the keys seemed to not even fit the doorknob anymore. The door opened on its own accord after she pulled the key away, and she ran inside to shelter from the rain and sat the lamp down. She claims she saw something run through the kitchen from the corner of her eye, and with the witch rumors about her wicked grandmother, decided to leave the lamp. She closed the door behind her, leaving the lamp, and when she stepped out onto the front porch, the rain had stopped, and there wasn't even a breeze, not a cloud in the sky. She still claims to this day that her grandmother's house was cursed. A few years later, my great-grandmother died. I attended the funeral, and my family made jokes the whole time. My grandmother was hardly sad that this day had come, as she had had to take care of the wicked woman who abused her, and she took care of her about everything she needed every day from her 70th birthday until her death at 102. She was relieved, and when the funeral home workers apologized and gave condolences, we all looked at each other. My aunt, stepping out of the restroom while the big ivory casket was being rolled into the chapel, accidentally whacked it with the door and nearly knocked it over, killing us all as we struggled not to burst into laughter. It was the most humorous funeral we'd ever attended. After her death, my grandmother was plagued with nightmares of her mother coming back to haunt her, or being trapped with her in the afterlife. One night, she found her husband walking around the house, shotgun in hand. She asked him what he was doing, and he looked terrified. This was the first occasion when a man in the house had experienced something paranormal. He was shaking, and he shouted to my grandmother, "Your mother is here." She begged him to explain what he was talking about, and he said, "I smell her. I feel her. She's here, don't you smell that?" Her mother had always worn the same perfume, Elizabeth Taylor's White Diamonds. It was the only perfume she'd ever worn, and she spritzed it on herself heavily every day, sometimes twice a day. It was a scent that had sickened my grandmother's husband for the whole time he'd known the old lady. My grandmother recently tried to give us some of her mother's old jewelry, because she wanted it out of the house so badly. She claimed it was cursed, and I believed her. My aunt certainly believed her, and my older cousin, though so long separated from our experiences as a child, refused to take the jewelry. I thought of taking it, but I already owned a piece of jewelry that was passed down through the women of our family through all the witches. It's a sapphire ring that saw several generations, and for some reason I find that more coincidental that it ended up with me. After my great-grandmother gave it to my grandmother, she gave it to my mother before I was born and said, "Give this to her." My mother didn't even know she was having a girl yet, and she asked her mother how she could assume I was a girl, and my grandmother simply said, "Just give this to her." And, well, here I am, a very paranormal type of girl wearing the witchy sapphire ring today. I haven't seen my older cousin in several years. The last time I saw her was at someone's funeral. She's a drug addict, and she moved far away. My older cousin got married and moved away and hasn't given the paranormal a second thought. It seems now that her memories have been completely erased when the topic of the witch in the computer room are brought up. It's as if she's a different person. My grandmother's friends never came around anymore, and whether they admit it or not, it's because of that ghostly witch. My mother thinks that my grandmother and I are crazy, but it seems we simply are more sensitive to these types of things. Recently, my grandmother said that she was in a store when a short, polite old woman approached her. She was in all white robes and she was shockingly pale, but she was friendly and exuded calm and happiness. She asked my grandmother to direct her to the exit, and she couldn't find it. When she was about to tell her where the exit was, the glowing white woman disappeared into thin air. Nobody believes me but her. I now have my own Ouija board, tarot cards, crystals, mirrors, and antique objects and dolls, as well as a dowsing rod, EMF meter, and EVP reader. For about 3 years I've obsessively tried to contact one particular ghost, and it wouldn't surprise me if I opened the doors to something else in the meantime, especially when considering the lengths I've gone to. I still try to contact this particular ghost, and for now, he only reaches out to me in my dreams. But if you go looking for long enough, I'm sure you're bound to find something. I live in a seaside town in southern Australia, one that has been settled by Europeans for over 100 years. There are plenty of alleged haunted places here and there, and I have seen and felt a few things myself. The scariest thing that happened to me was when I went to a hotel. It's been investigated by paranormal groups and there is even a book about haunted places around southern Australia in which the hotel features. There is the story that a little girl was killed, run over by a horse and cart in the late 19th century. There's also the story of the young boy who ended his own life because of his cruel parents, and I believe I experienced the presence of this boy. I'd felt some spirits in that place, and I was pretty certain I could sense the boy. Anyway, I went home without thinking too much about it, but later on is when it became interesting. That night, I got up late to use the bathroom. There was soft moonlight shining through the glass sliding door on my way in, and my way back from the lavatory to the bedroom, I saw a figure standing in the room. It looked as solid as a living person, but had its back to me. It was the form of a young boy, and I immediately knew what I was looking at and was both shocked and surprised. I was extremely scared and worried. I chose to be a coward, to rush past the figure and pretended I never noticed it. I quickly did what most people do and hid under my covers. I had never seen a spirit look so realistic or so solid before. There is also a less frightening experience I had in a local tattoo studio. This building was once a bank some years ago, and the building is over 100 years old. There was some other business in it prior to the studio moving there, but I don't recall what it was. One day while getting a tattoo myself, I was talking to the tattoo artist when I heard a female voice, except there were no other females there at the time. I also felt a decidedly feminine energy, and I asked the tattooist if the building had a spirit in it, and if it was a female. He confirmed to both questions, and next I felt someone brush the top of my head as I was having my tattoo done. I thought my 9-year-old son had touched my head, as he was there waiting for me to take him out to the playground, instead of spending several hours watching me get a tattoo. Turns out no one had touched me. That's when I knew it had to have been the female spirit. These were not the first times I have been touched by a spirit, or heard one or saw one. Until 1997, I had no idea a spirit had the ability to physically touch someone, until it happened to me. I love going to old places with history. You just have to be careful sometimes. You never know when a spirit might decide to follow you home. Summer of 2017 is when I witnessed firsthand something dark. Me and my boyfriend at the time had a friend called Ashley that we would visit a lot. She lived in a large apartment building on the 2nd floor. She also mentioned her downstairs neighbor a few times to us. She was kind of creeped out by the lady who lived there, since she never once saw her leave her apartment within the 6 months she already resided there, and had no idea what she even looked like. She had a sign on her door that stated, "Protected by witchcraft," and had tiny mirrors hanging in all her windows, with the reflection sides facing outwards. She told us that she always heard birds screaming in the middle of the night, daily nearly. Curious about all this, we decided to go downstairs to take a peek at the sign on her door. My ex then informed me that he had an extremely bad vibe as soon as we stepped into the hallway, and couldn't stay another minute in that building. It wasn't until the maintenance men went into the apartment that we realized we were not wrong or crazy for being nervous and slightly afraid of this woman. 2 men were making their rounds to each unit, providing everyone with fresh light bulbs. When the men get to Ashley's apartment, one of them looked ghostly white from fear and had told her that when they entered the apartment below, they instantly felt an evil presence within. The woman had painted her walls black and added red symbols all around, including the floor and ceiling. She didn't have any furniture besides a mantel surrounded by candles, and had a room that was chained up that she refused to let them go into. This room had a window that happened to be right next to the front entrance, so there's no avoiding having to walk by it if you wanted to get inside. One night, we decided to pay Ashley a visit in the middle of the night. I had an urge to take a picture of the windows with the mirrors, so I could prove I wasn't lying when I told the story about her. As we walked to the front entrance, we both noticed right away that the light was on in the mysteriously locked room. While waiting for Ashley to let us into the building, all that I could hear was the sound of a screaming bird. If I took a guess, I'd say it was a crow, but I have never in my life heard any kind of birds making that noise. I went to double check the time and saw that it was 3:30 a.m. Being freaked out by this resulted in us cutting our visit short and not visiting her as often anymore. On our way home, I looked at the picture I took. While analyzing, I noticed that every window mirror was gleaming off the streetlights except for one. Instead, the first window to the left looked to be a distorted face peering out a bit, and seemed like it was created by smoke. This made me feel extremely uneasy every time we went back. I couldn't help but feel like that woman was a danger to us all, and everyone who lived nearby. I'm just happy Ashley no longer lives there, and I don't have to be afraid of being cursed anymore. This happened in early 2017. I was a 23-year-old girl and had just finished college. The field I studied was not huge in my area, so I knew I had to leave it, and I moved to the biggest city in my country in order to pursue a post-grad course and look for a job. As I was still unemployed, I thought I would wait to make a long-term rental contract, worrying about a bad commute to work. In the first few months, I was switching between Airbnbs and hostels all the time. I was tired of this and decided this would be my last move, and then, with or without a job, I would settle. I was already running out of money and decided to stay in a dorm in a hostel next to where I was taking classes. Sharing a bedroom is not a problem with me during a trip, but when you're living somewhere trying to create a routine and have some privacy, sharing a bathroom with complete strangers just sucks. I would share the dorm with 3 guys, but it's not with any of them my bad encounter was. They were nice, apart from them snoring badly at night. In another dorm, however, was the creepiest person I'd ever met. He was in his mid-30s and not traveling. He was a native from the city we were in and was using the hostel as a new house since his parents kicked him out of theirs. He introduced himself and tried to be nice and flirty. I was polite, but declined his interest. He wouldn't stop. He started following me all day long inside the hostel. Anywhere I went, he would show up in less than 5 minutes. On my second day there, I left the hostel to a job interview, and by the time I arrived late into the night, he was sitting alone in the front stair waiting for me. He told me I was the most beautiful thing on earth, and that he would buy me snacks, ask me out, and try to get information about my personal life. All the while, I had made it very clear that I wasn't interested. This happened in 3 days. I was already exhausted of his presence, but what I didn't know is that it would get worse. As soon as one of the guys that was sharing the dorm with me left, he asked hostel staff to switch dorms and stay in the same as me. Obviously, he never told me, so imagine how surprised and disgusted I was when I saw him coming to the dorm with all his belongings. I was so afraid of his presence that I kept sleeping with jeans on to avoid any sort of terrible situation. The very next morning, I knew I had to go. The situation had exponentially gone worse, and I couldn't handle it anymore. While I was packing, this guy showed up, noticed what I was doing and started to cry, asking me not to leave him. Then, to make things more creepy and disgusting, he told me he would miss seeing my face when I was asleep, and that he would have to take photos. I was trying my best to be chill about this, but I lost it when he told me he had taken pictures of me sleeping. I took his phone out of his hand and asked to see the pictures and delete them all. There was a bunch of me sleeping in the night before, and I left the hostel and really regretted not reporting him to the staff. I hope to never meet this creep again. I was 22 years old and had just graduated from college with a bachelor's degree in computer programming and was feeling like a hotshot. I moved into a nice little studio apartment, which was actually a motel room at one point, before the apartment company took over and did renovations. The area was nice, with lots of trees, beautiful views, and a small river that ran behind the apartments. Being situated 10 miles outside of the city meant that there were not that many people who frequented our area, but I was glad of that, as it would be nice to have some peace and quiet to focus on my programming and web design skills. I remember hearing everyone in high school and college ramble about being on the deep/dark web, as you may say. The uses are actually quite interchangeable, however they also are two very different parts of the internet as a whole. You have the ClearNet, that can be accessed by anyone with an internet connection, and a search engine such as Google. Then you have the deep web, which is the greater part of the internet that cannot be accessed without a special program or browser such as Tor. And finally, inside of the deep web, you have the dark web, or even the dark net, where most of the horrific stories you hear about take place. Hearing all of these stories from either friends or from reading them over the years online intrigued me and sent me on the career path that, at the time, I thought I truly wanted. Now, not so much. My goal was simple: to create a program that would run without the use of a script that would actually be disguised as a profile picture if someone opened the file. Then my program could execute and be able to look directly into the computer's system logs and records, and will be able to sniff out the original IP of the affected computer, as well as any personal information such as names, birthdays, and credit card numbers. Now I know what you're thinking. I was definitely up to no good in creating a program like this, but you would be wrong. After hearing some of the truly horrifying people that hide on the dark web, and seeing as many of the stories end with those same people never getting caught, I couldn't fathom why no one made a program to catch these people. I worked out how I could do it, think like and pretend to be one of them. When I had finally compiled the program, compressed it down to less than 1 megabyte, and disguised it like a picture file, I planned to use it. I was ready to test it out. I pulled out my old junky laptop that I used for school. This thing was a pure piece of garbage, and the perfect testbed for anything that I created. I connected the laptop to the internet and created a test email and sent the file. I had to test different methods of delivery, so I also used a private Dropbox so that I could test email delivery and opening, direct placements from a flash drive, and the big one that I was counting on, downloading the file and opening it from the internet outside of email programs. When all three methods worked, I started sending the plethora of data to my main laptop in the form of updated notepads. I jumped for joy. So basic IP and personal information sniffing works. What about if they're pros using multiple VPNs and the like? I installed 2 separate VPN programs on my test laptop. I even connected to a proxy server through them to test the results. They still came back the same, just showing the additional IP addresses from the VPN. I was now ready to hunt these people. My studying in school had paid off, having allowed me the knowledge to be able to create this amazing tool. I would be able to make my own show like Chris Hansen, To Catch a Predator. But mine would be called To Catch a Webber. Yes, my ego was extremely high at the time, but I could not celebrate, not until I knew 100% that it worked without a doubt against a third party. This is when things really began to get interesting. I had Tor and the hidden wiki open up, and my VPN fully configured, and I was ready to go. I wanted to get to the dark web, and most people find it by clicking something randomly. I selected a random website from the hidden wiki to begin my journey. Just a basic news board, mainly spreading support to those who were oppressed around the world. I clicked on another link, and it took me to a blank page. I waited a few seconds and still nothing, so I tried another link. This one took me to some jewelry site, and after reading some, I noticed that the end of each ad boasted that the jewelry was stolen from graves of fresh and old, with some being claimed to be thousands of years old. Like most sites on the deep and dark web, Bitcoin was the currency used, and I saw enough there and was about to go back and try another link, when a chat box popped up with the generic name admin followed by a message. Hello, welcome to our site. Everything is 100% authentic, antiques, and unique. Is there anything specific that you're looking for today? I must admit I wasn't caught off guard at all. With normal online stores, this is pretty standard, so I typed out my reply confidently. You know, I was actually just looking at your selection. So much to choose from, it's a little overwhelming, and I'm just mainly browsing. Within 5 seconds, I had a reply from admin. We look forward to seeing your purchase. Please let us know if we can assist further. Okay, now that seriously took me back. They told me they were looking forward to seeing my purchase. Screw that. I clicked out without even replying. I had double-checked and set up, and everything was still 100% anonymous. My VPN was still working, so that eased my paranoia. I clicked another link, and this time was taken to a black web page with white text in the center. I couldn't even read it. When I looked closer, it didn't even look like real writing. I clicked it, and a box popped up, asking for what I'm assuming was login info. Obviously, I didn't have that. But oddly enough, yet another chat box propped up, and I just see, I got you. Info started being entered into the first box. The next screen I see is white with what appeared to be a directory to many different areas. The chat box appeared again and read, "Enjoy and behave." I had no clue who that was, or where to even start in the directory. I know there are so many horrible people hiding here, but I wanted to stop the killers more than anything else. I'd heard so many stories of red rooms and people being taken and used for other pleasures and dying horrific deaths, and I had to help stop that. I was on a mission. I clicked a random link and the page slowly loaded. There were 3 pictures displayed: a storm, a green pasture in sunlight, and a knife. Obviously, I clicked on the knife and was loaded into the dark web equivalent of a sick and sadistic Instagram of death. I saw one picture of an older guy laying on a couch with a gag in his mouth titled "Vomit Death." A small description said the poster thought it would be funny to watch their friend drown in their own drunken vomit. They went on to brag about how the gag relieved them of any legal responsibility in the death because it was deemed a stupid drunken game. I wanted to nail the guy, but I continued on. Another image was of a young girl, probably in her early 20s, hanging from a tree with the title, "A Death I Part." The small description read, "You wanted till death do us part. Now you have it, and I'm free. This one confused me, and still does now for a few reasons. Was this a suicide or a murder? And who posted it? The next picture I saw really caught my eye. It looked like one of the pieces of jewellery I had looked at on the jewellery site. A bracelet. In fact, the very one, the exact one that prompted the chat log to pop up. At this point I knew better than to click on it, but I was also arrogant in my ego and had full confidence in my program. I clicked the picture, and this time there was a small handwritten note. "Hello, we need your business. You did not make a purchase." After reading that, my heart practically stopped. I was then automatically redirected back to the jewellery site and looking at the same damn bracelet. "We knew that you would be back to make your purchase." I did not even know what to say before they added, "The site you were just on is also run by us. We helped you log in so you could get a small taste of our different varieties of content. Access is subscription-based, and you pay for access by buying our jewellery. Furthermore, if you do not make a purchase, then we will restrict further and future access to our sites, as well as release your browsing habits to your friends and family. You have 10 minutes to decide." I simply replied, "Searching is not a crime. I didn't find much of value on your other websites. I've seen better and don't wear jewellery. So, sorry, no sale." I felt like a smug bastard, knowing they couldn't know who I am personally or even track me, but the reply I got shocked me. Whatever site contains the content you viewed is all under us. You don't know what you're getting into or how big our business is. Simply make a purchase so we can move on. I get aggressive sales tactics, but this takes the cake in being intertwined with blackmail and extortion. I wouldn't have it and replied, "I refuse to be blackmailed or extorted by people or entities claiming to have false information on me. Unlike you people, I have proof of a better site that does not strong-arm their users. You cannot provide any information on me, about me, like I'm sure you can on others, and you know this." Admin typed back, "You have no proof. You're probably some kid acting out. Tell you what, show me your proof and I'll show you mine." Arrogant. The time I had been waiting for had arrived. I uploaded the image to the secure site and messaged them when it was done. I didn't get a reply right away, but after about 3 minutes I knew they opened the image, thus executing the hidden program because I started getting a plethora of log updates. This happened for about 5 minutes before the logs stopped updating, and another 5 minutes before the admin finally came back and said, "I thought you had proof of a better site than ours, James. Truly I am disappointed, but not surprised. No site tops what we provide as a whole, and you do not even understand how deep things go. As for the picture of your cat, very sneaky, but you did not consider your serious flaw, that anyone with knowledge of how your little toy works can reverse engineer it, dismantle it, and can find where the information is being sent to. You are in a very nice secluded area and easily traceable, unlike me, who is operating under many different aliases, stolen identities that are on throwaway laptops. I can be mobile in a matter of seconds, gone without a trace. Let me share a few things with you to help you make the wise choice in your situation. Our image site of the deceased that you saw and clicked through, well, some of those people are people who became an issue, and their jewellery, one of the millions of pieces we have available currently on top, is what we have collected over the years. Now, are you going to make a purchase?" My jaw hit the floor. I was speechless, and this lunatic was absolutely right. I did not account for being traced back through my own program because of my arrogance, not to mention the fact that if they were really using multiple identities, tracking down the prep wasn't going to happen. I couldn't reply. I was frozen in fear when another bit of text popped into the chat box. "James, I know you're still there. Just make a purchase, James, and we both disappear afterwards and have no further contact. I do not want to send my associates to you. You haven't truly insulted us yet. Just make a purchase, and all of this can be done. Don't spit in the face of our work." I slammed my laptop to the ground and started stomping on it like the scene in The Office Space, where they beat the crap out of the printer. Pieces were flying all over the place, and it was just an unrecognizable pile of metal and bits. I was on a month-to-month lease at the time, and moved out the next day to another place in the city. It was more expensive and the location sucked, but knowing I had lots of other people around me constantly made me feel safe, and it still does. That was 3 years ago, and I am still living in the place I moved into after this happened. I have since stuck to web design and have stayed far away from the deep web and dark web. Nothing has come of it as far as I know, but they could still be out there, watching and waiting, and then I may become part of their content. When I was in middle school, I convinced my parents that for summer vacation we should go to a haunted hotel. So we went to the Menga Hotel in San Antonio. Well, for the first visit, I videotaped walking through the hotel with my dad and best friend. I didn't catch anything except a loud bang while we were rounding a corner, a girl whimper, and someone say, "You get down." Since then, I can't find the video, but while we walked through there, dead silence like you wouldn't expect walking through hotel hallways. Me and my best friend also ran up and down the halls late at night and heard people running above us on the 3rd floor. Excited, we ran up to see who was there, and there was no one. A security guard had actually come around the second time, and we met this really chilled out lady taking photos, and she covered for us. But the lady and I got into a really interesting conversation, and she told us that her daughter and herself were mediums, and that every night at the foot of her and her husband's bed, there was a little boy standing there. She was really sweet, and told her about what we had been experiencing, and never saw her on the trip again. Finally, we came back home, and I entered my room to see one of my frames on the wall fell and shattered. The next morning I woke up, but I felt a hand at the foot of my bed. It was hard enough to wake me, and I knew I felt it by my feet. I remember once I woke up right before 10 and asked if it wouldn't wake me up. It never did after that. I thought I might be going a little crazy, but my dog was sleeping with me on the bed one night and jolted awake with me the following morning. It was never creepy because that was the extent of the paranormal I would say followed me home. It went away after I complained about it to my friend over the phone. Let me give you a bit of background. I am an 18-year-old male. I'm 5'10" and not the biggest guy, and have been seeing and hearing things since I was 6. This story takes place in the 4th house I lived in, as we're currently on my 5th, and was where the activity really picked up and actually scared me half to death. To the best of my recollection, my first accounts of the paranormal was when I was 6 years old. I heard footsteps around me when I would be in the basement, and then something had grabbed a pile of papers of my drawings off my dresser in my room and thrown them against the adjacent wall. It didn't help that my aunt had a dark entity in her basement who took the form of a large, imposing man. I personally never saw him, but my cousins did. We can't stand to be down there for longer than a minute, and would sprint up the stairs. This all took place in my 2nd house, then in my 3rd, when I was 12 or so. Visual phenomenon started to occur. It was here where I saw doors open and close, shadow figures on 2 occasions, and an apparition of a tall and lanky male in a striped shirt and jeans out of the corner of my eye. After that, the occurrences stopped for years. I thought I wouldn't see anything again, but I have never been so wrong in all my life. It was about 2 years after I moved to my third house in 2017. I was 17 at the time and had an unfinished basement with concrete floors and no drywall and a completely open area. There were 3 light bulbs in this basement. The shape of the basement was almost a deformed O shape, and the lights were placed at the ends of the U and one end in the middle. So whenever I went to work out in the basement, only the light bulb in the space in front of me, one of the other ends, would start to flicker and flash, sometimes fast, other times not. It would only happen when I stepped onto the treadmill and would keep going till I stopped completely off, even if the treadmill was off. Then I would occasionally see a shadow in that space when I'm not moving. This shadow would peek its head up from some boxes and then duck back after I noticed. My cats would also look over at a space and as if someone was standing there. However, these lights were the occurrences that led up to what would be happening later. It was a Sunday night in summer at about 1 a.m. I was watching comedy YouTube videos and working on a piece of digital art. Out of habit, and so I can hear my family if they call me whenever, I have my headphones off one ear and it was dead silent. My cats were with me at the time, both being asleep next to me. It was a little while after that I heard a blood-curdling scream, as if a murder had just occurred downstairs. Only a few seconds after the scream and taking my headphones off, did I hear a woman's voice. To my best recollection, the voice of the woman was corresponding to the scream and said, "Why are you screaming?" So I'm practically floored and had to investigate. I walk out of my bedroom and down the hall to the loft area and staircase. At first I had tried to rationalize that maybe my sister had a nightmare, and my mum woke up and checked on her. So I checked her room, which was upstairs, and lo and behold, my little sister was asleep in bed, having passed out while watching makeup tutorials. Officially creeped out, I head to the stairs and lean over the railings, and I'm met with complete and utter darkness. There were no lights, no glow from the TV, and at this point I am just a mix of confused and concerned, but will myself go back to my room. So I settled down in bed and continued on the commission I was on, but this time I kept my headphones off and worked in silence, my senses on high alert. It was about 15 minutes or so before the activity continued. Surprisingly loud footsteps started up the carpeted stairs and up to the loft area. It was then, I'm pretty sure at that point I had paled a few shades, and a male voice sounded from the loft, and I can tell it wasn't my dad and surely wasn't me. So I got into protective mode since, unlike my room, my little sister's room was accessible from the loft, so I grabbed the only weapon I had in the room, a switchblade, as I thought it was possible an intruder could be in the house. I texted one of my exes, as we're still friends, who was still awake in the group chat we had. I told him what was going on, and that if I didn't answer in a certain time frame saying it was okay, to call the police. So I searched the house and couldn't find anyone. I looked on all levels of the house and looked to see if there was a car outside, if the doors were open and a window cracked. There were no signs of intrusion. These events were only the starting point of what was to come. So as the months passed, there was the usual flickering and shadow in the basement. But I figured the light was just a wiring issue and was logical. That was until it started answering questions. I was messing around once after I was working out and was like, fine, if someone is there, make the lights flicker twice. And it did, on command. I never asked more questions. I didn't want to get involved with whatever that thing was. However, it kept going on, and I heard footsteps on several occasions in the hall. A shadow figure came up behind me, another scream, and something touched my hand at one point. So much activity was occurring that I kept a journal on my phone of the time and days of these occurrences to see if I was going crazy or not. After about a month, I was pissed off and started bad-mouthing whatever it was when I was in the basement and instantly regretted it. As soon as the final word escaped my lips, I felt an immense burning sensation on my hip under my clothing. I pulled my clothing away and was greeted by a scratch running about 5 inches, starting at my hip and ending just above my mid-thigh. Then about 2 days later at 1 a.m., I was sleeping in my room and heard the papers of my desk start rustling and moving around as if someone were going through my stuff. My first instinct is that my kitten, who is extremely mischievous, was there. The thing was, there wasn't anyone there. I roll over onto my stomach and look at my tomcat, who's on the bed with me. He's looking wide-eyed behind me and starts to puff up like those Halloween decorations, a large growl in his throat. I was about to speak to him when I feel what felt like 2 hands on my shoulder blades and a pressure on my lower back like when someone sits on you. It felt as if one of my friends was sitting on me after we tussled. At first I thought, am I experiencing sleep paralysis? I've never had sleep paralysis, but my mum has, and that was when I realized that I was awake and able to move. Instinctively, I start trying to thrash around and get whatever is on top of me off. Whatever it was wouldn't let up off my stomach, so I was swinging my arms behind me. When my arms struck the area above my back, I felt an immense cold as if I had plunged my arm into an ice bath. However, this somehow got whatever it was off me, and I instantly flipped myself over to sit up and look around at nothing. It was at this time that my cat started to calm down again, but neither of us fell back asleep that night. It was later on in the day where I felt the same burning sensation a few days prior on my other hip, and an almost complete cut was on my leg. It was completely incidental in placement and length as the previous one, but this time whatever did it drew blood, and this time I had enough and took every kind of measure I could to keep this thing at bay. Luckily this stopped as we moved out 2 months later or so. Whatever it was didn't follow me to my new house, and I have been able to live 2 years without these experiences and be at peace. However, there are times where I wonder what that thing was and wonder what it wanted. Did it only ever want to hurt? Was it trying to do something else? I don't know, and even if this was only curiosity, I don't want to find out. From what I've heard, a new family lives there, and now I wonder if they have experienced anything like I had. After some research, I think the figure, or the entity, could be called a night hag. It's a spirit that forces you down in some cases of sleep paralysis. I learnt of the figure of speech from my grandfather, on my mother's side, as he has a similar experience and he would claim that there would be a witch on his back. I later found out from my mother that it's a saying mostly from the African American community, even if this is a global phenomenon, that there is a witch on your back. In my family's case, it is from the folklore in Africa. I don't know which area yet. I'm not sure if it was a witch, but it sure as hell scared the crap out of me, and I still can't explain what happened to me. To take things back to the beginning, at the time of this, I was 14. I was a competitive dancer, and with that came a lot of traveling and a lot of stays in hotels. On this particular trip, we were going to Fargo, North Dakota. We would be there for 5 days, so we needed to find a reasonably priced hotel, but was also obviously safe. Me, my mum, my best friend Beth, and Beth's mum were going to carpool the 4 hours to Fargo and stay in the same hotel room. We made the 4-hour drive and pulled up to our day's inn we had booked. Everything went as normal. My mum and Beth's mum checked in while Beth and I sat in the locked car. Once our mums came back with our room keys, we got our suitcases and made our way up to our room. We were on the 2nd floor, and being in the city for a dance competition, we had tons of luggage. To our disadvantage, there was no elevator in the hotel, only a tiny flight of winding stairs. Let me just explain the layout of this hotel. When we walked into the hotel doors, the check-in desk was to our right, and 2 couches sitting opposite each other were on the left. Straight in front of the entrance doors was the door to the pool, going past the check-in desk. You could turn left or right to get to the main floor hotel rooms. At the end of each hallway to your left was the staircase I mentioned earlier. Getting back to the story, we walked into the hotel and took a right at the check-in desk, and we were going to the end of the hall and up the stairs, our luggage clunking behind us. Once we made it up the stairs, our hotel room was halfway down the hall to the left. We approached our room, and as Beth's mum tried to use our keycard to open the wood door, the light on the door that would usually turn green, saying we could enter, turned red, meaning that our car was not activated properly. So Beth's mum went back to the front desk to get a new card. Me, my mum, and Beth waited outside our room joking and laughing about how our trip was off to such a great start, when a shorter, skinny, balding man approached us. He looked to be in his late 20s to early 30s. He approached us and said to my mum, "Where did you get your tattoos?" My mum at the time only had a couple of smaller, less noticeable ones, so you'd really have to be staring at her in order to see them. My mum goes, "Just a friend who does them back home." He then told us all that if we were interested, we could go into his room, and he motioned to it, and said that he can give us all some new ink. Obviously, we politely declined, and my mum told the man that we were only 14. He mumbled to himself and went back to his room. Just as he entered his room, Beth's mum came back and asked who that guy was. We explained the conversation, and then totally forgot as we entered our room. Later that day, we decided to go out and eat at a small restaurant that was a 10-minute drive from our hotel. I was the first one to exit the room, and at the end of the hallway across from the stairs was the same man sitting on the windowsill looking outside. I kind of gave my mum the look. You know, the look when you don't want to draw attention to yourself by directly pointing or saying, "Look over there." She casually looked, and we gathered up enough courage to walk down the hall towards the stairs. As we approached him, I came upon the shocking realization that he was giggling to himself and carving something into the window with a knife. I let out a small gasp as he turns to me and gently stroked the blade. Me, Beth, and our mums booked it down the stairs and ran to the front desk to alert the guy who was working there. He didn't seem to care, but he told us he would look into the matter. Mine and Beth's mum stood at the desk talking to the man, while I asked Beth's mum for the keys so that Beth and I could sit in there safely. She unlocked the doors to the vehicle, and I called Beth to follow me. She was texting her boyfriend and told me to just wait up for her. Our mums had just finished talking to the guy, so we were all standing in the doorway waiting for Beth, when I turn around and noticed the man standing directly behind Beth. I grabbed her arm and told her that we needed to go. She kept resisting and saying she needed to respond to her boyfriend before we left because she wouldn't have Wi-Fi at the restaurant. Finally, I screamed at her to get off her phone and we sprinted to the car and got in. We made the drive to the restaurant and Beth and I were hysterical. Once we got there, we called the hotel to tell them we weren't staying there and we wanted a refund. The manager was reluctant and asked us to come back so we could talk about the situation. I don't know why, but we went back, gathered all of our belongings as fast as we could, throwing whatever we could fit in whichever bag was closest. Beth's mum was so freaked out she was throwing up heavily in the bathroom. I don't know when the police were called, but as we exited our room, the man's door was open a crack and an older woman sat there. I think she was trying to calm down the creepy man. I peeked in and saw 3 big trash bags under his bed and weapons sitting on the little table across from it. Again, being the idiot that I am, I gasped and the 2 people in the room turned around. We quickly ran downstairs with all of our stuff and went to a new hotel, and a very expensive one at that. The front desk worker at Days Inn was just a part-time guy, and his shift had just started. He'd got thrown into the situation and ended up being the one we spoke to about our refund, since we hadn't even stayed the night there. He gave us our money back and said something along the lines of, "This should never happen, and I know my boss won't want me to refund your stay, but this is unacceptable, and if they want to fire me for helping you guys out, so be it." God bless that guy, and I hope he knows what a godsend he was at that moment. Honestly, I'm glad we got out of there when we did, because I don't want to know what his intentions were when he got us into his room, and it haunts me every day, not knowing what was in those 3 garbage bags under his bed. I'm just happy that we all made it out alive. Never, ever go on the deep web. I was at high school talking to one of my friends who told me about it. He said that we should go and look through the deep web after school. So when school was over, we went to my house and got to my computer. We downloaded Tor and went through a bunch of links. These links just have random letters and numbers with .onion, because like I said, it cannot be searched with search engines like Google. We clicked on one link that took us to the black market, where contrabands and such like drugs and guns were being sold. There was this one drug that looked red, and it cost 8,000 bitcoins. We asked each other, should we buy it? And he said, why not? So we bought it. But then we realized we didn't have any money. Then this ad pops up and says, don't have money? Buy here. So we're like, hell yeah, and we clicked. The website was a mixture of black, red and blue, and a message popped up. Hey Johnny and Dan, do you mind if you give us your credit card information? So we said, yeah. We all of a sudden had the money to buy what we needed. Thank you, we typed in, and the user typed, you're welcome, have a great day John and Dan. We looked at each other with creeped out faces. We heard my mother's car parking as she came in fast, slammed the door and was on the phone to somebody. I asked what happened, and she said that someone had stolen her credit card information. The person she was on the phone to was someone that worked for her bank. We got chills when she told us. She said that her bank was trying to get back her credit card info, and she went off to eat with my father, who unknowingly was downstairs, while me and my friend were upstairs. When they left, we decided to try and find that user, but the website had been shut down. We still tried to find him and we clicked on another link, but the screen went black. Then a masked man appeared on our screen. Hey Johnny and Dan, I hope you're scared. We aren't scared, who are you? I'm the one who stole your mum's credit card info. The man then yelled at someone, and a woman who had been gagged came out. Johnny, we gotta get out of this. He's gonna do something really bad to her. But I didn't listen. He then got out a knife, pulled down his pants, and started doing something unspeakable. Are you enjoying it, Johnny and Dan? No? We tried to exit, but there was no escape. You're stuck here now, the man said. And then the screen went black as Dan unplugged the computer. We should not get on this ever again. Well, why did you tell me about this stuff in the first place? I thought you'd be interested. Sorry, Johnny. My parents weren't going to be home till midnight, and I told Dan to go home because I was furious. So I was home alone and feeling scared. At about 9 o'clock, I'm watching TV, when all of a sudden I hear a faint knock on the front door. I didn't open it because I was afraid, so I went to the closet, left the lights off, and was getting ready to call the police. Johnny, I know you're here. Come out wherever you are. Footsteps. I heard footsteps. They stopped at my bedroom door, and I called the police. I should also mention that my father is a federal firearms owner and has about 9 guns. I had already obtained one of his guns before I hid. I was dialing 911 just as the man was opening the closet. 911, what's your emergency? Came out of the other side. There's a man in my house, I responded. My dad is a firearm owner and I have one of his guns. All right, the police are on their way. Do you know how to use it? Yeah, my dad taught me how to shoot since I was 10. If the man opens the door, shoot him. Okay, I said. The man opens the door, and gunshots go off 4 times. He's on the ground, blood oozing out of his head. The police arrive and confirm he is dead. My parents then arrived shocked. I told them the whole story, and my parents were furious and then sad. A few days later, the police called my mother and confirmed that it was him who stole the credit cards. He was convicted of 5 counts of sexual assault, as well as a few other disturbing things. So yeah, people, never go on the deep web. It might be the end of you. While visiting my family in the island of Lombok, Indonesia, I heard of what I believe to be known as a witch called Leuk fall from the sky onto the roof. I have lived in Australia my whole life, but my dad, who is from Indonesia, has family over there. 3 years ago, I, along with my mum, dad and sister, was staying with my dad's family, and something creepy happened. We were sleeping in a back room of my uncle's deli under a corrugated iron ceiling. The room was small and only had one small window, which was just a square cut out, with 4 or 5 metal rods in it, like you imagine a jail cell would have. The window had a small curtain over it. In the middle of the night, my whole family and I suddenly awoke to an extremely loud bang on our roof, followed by scratching. The sound was too loud to be created by something as large as a dog or cat. There were no trees for an animal to jump or fall from, and my mum, who has never experienced anything paranormal living in Australia her whole life, became a little worried. Even she was suspecting something otherworldly. My dad wasn't surprised though. He told me many stories of the supernatural while he lived in Indonesia. The next morning, my dad told his brother and sister about what happened. They weren't surprised. They told him that recently, almost every night, Liaks have been running around on people's roofs. They described them as humans with crow-like wings, running, flying, and screaming. Pretty much next to my uncle's deli in our land, there is a village which has their own culture and beliefs. My other uncle married a woman from that village, so our family are quite close with the people. In that village, there is a shaman and a man and woman called Dukun. They're an old couple, and the villagers always go to them with a problem regarding spirits or the supernatural. The wife is a small old lady whose teeth are stained a reddish black due to chewing on betel nuts all day long. The husband, I can't remember his appearance. My family visited them once because they wanted to perform some type of ritual with us, perhaps a cleansing or something. My dad told me the Dukan suspected that there were a few leaks in the area. The lady and her mother lived in the house next door to my uncle's deli, and they were the ones who were suspected. They thought it was best that they just keep it to themselves and not accuse the ladies of something like this. The creepy thing is, the neighbor's house was next to our room, right where the small window was. In the few nights that I stayed there, I was sleeping right next to the window, and I had a terrible night's sleep. I woke up with a very bad heat rash and was very uncomfortable. My dad told me that several times in the night, he noticed the curtain on the window open, and even though he kept closing it, he had a strange feeling that someone was looking in. After a bit of information about these legs, we were told that they're humans who practice in black magic, causing them to turn into supernatural beings. In each region of Indonesia, there are different types of creatures like this with different names and appearances. But in Bali and Lombok, it is known as leak. During the day they appear as normal human, but at night they leave the house and do whatever they wish. I have experienced many more stories from my dad, and they are all quite haunting. We were staying in a historic home in the old girls' wing in room number 6. I was around 11 and had not been told this house was haunted. There was only one other family staying in the whole house, as it was huge, and they were on a totally opposite wing on the ground floor. There were stairs on the floor above us in the main house, and at around 11 p.m. someone started running up and down them over and over. Everyone was asleep, and exactly at midnight, I heard a little girl speak. It sounded like she was in the room with us, but I have no idea what the voice was saying, but she repeated a phrase 3 times. Being scared to death, I called my mum and she immediately woke up and heard the voice too. Then my brother and I woke up, and he and I both heard a chair in the room squeaking, like someone was bouncing up and down on it. Also in the middle of the night, my brother woke up on the floor, as if someone had pushed him from the bed. I found out later the family of the house had a young daughter who died tragically, and to this day, I still cannot sleep in old homes.